We've been at this for a little bit. Happy Friday. I am Pamela, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the Aboriginal Affairs Advisory Committee. The committee secretary has confirmed that we have quorum, so I will call the meeting 14 of the Aboriginal Affairs Advisory Committee to order. This meeting is being held using the city's WebEx technology, with members and staff connecting by video conference or by calling in. Because we are meeting remotely, we ask for your patience with any delays and technical issues. And today, I'm excited to report we have 2 registered speakers today. The public can watch the meeting streaming live on YouTube at youtube.com/Toronto City Council Live. And I would like to remind all staff and presenters to please keep their mic muted with their video turned off unless they need to address the committee. This will make it easier for the co-chairs and those watching along on YouTube to observe members as they participate in the debate and vote on each item. Members, please keep your mic muted unless you wish to question staff or speak to an item, and ensure that your video is turned on. As part of each agenda item, we will ask members to raise their hand or unmute their mic if they wish to question staff or to speak. We will then create a speakers list and will call on members when it is their turn to speak. When voting on an item or a motion, I ask that members ensure that they turn on their video and raise their hand to indicate their vote. I want to remind everyone that although you are participating remotely, you must still submit your motions in writing to the committee secretary. The clerks are available by email at AAAC@toronto.ca to help with motions. To start off the meeting in a good way, we will now have the offering of medicines by Selena Young, Director of Indigenous Affairs Office, to be followed by an opening blessing by Francis Anderson. I put the floor to you, Selena.
Merci, Pam. I have my bundle here, and today I've lit tobacco and sage, calling in Creator and our ancestors to help us be together in a good way, with kindness and humility.
Nokomis Mishamis, Creator, grandfathers, grandmothers, miigwech for this day and all the gifts you've given us, our lives, our families, our friends, our work, and our community. Creator, help us to honor those gifts and take them to heart so that we think in a good way, we see in a good way, we listen intently to what each person has to say, and we do things with a passion from our hearts for the right reasons. We have to remember this time of year. This is the time when we gather, when we put things away for the winter, when we put things away to sustain us through the cold months that are yet to come. Lord, help us to put our good thoughts on the table. Help us to contribute to the circle so that we'll have these good thoughts and we'll have good wishes and we'll have good things come the winter months. Creator, help us to think of those who are not at our table, those who are suffering, who are vulnerable, who are worried, who are sick, particularly those who have suffered through this pandemic, whether it's mental, physical, or spiritual. Help us to keep them in our hearts and in our wishes. So for all these things, Creator, we ask that you help us and guide us through this meeting and give us the good common sense to do the right thing. So for all these things, Creator, we say, miigwech, miigwech, chimiigwech.
Miigwech. Thank you, Selena and Francis. So although we are in different locations and meeting remotely today, the Aboriginal Affairs Advisory Committee acknowledges the land that we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse nations, Inuit and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Are there any declarations of interest at this time under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act? If you have an interest, please raise your hand or unmute your mic to let us know. Seeing none, may I have a motion to confirm the minutes from our last committee meeting on August 10th, 2021? Suzanne? All those in favor? Any opposed? The motion carries. So at this time, I would like to move a motion to excuse the absence of members who have sent regrets for today's meeting. Can the clerk staff please display the motion on the screen? Thank you. So the Aboriginal Affairs Advisory Committee excused the absence of Angus D. Palmer from the October 22nd, 2021 Aboriginal Affairs Advisory Committee meeting. All those in favor, please raise your hand. Any opposed? Seeing none, the motion carries. So before proceeding to the next agenda items, I would like to add a new item of business, which I will now introduce. This item is new item AA14.7, vacancy on the Aboriginal Affairs Advisory Committee. And this is a letter from the City Clerk regarding the resignation of member Blanche Mawasagi from the committee. It is an information item only, intended to serve as formal notice to the committee about the new vacancy and the departure of Blanche in her seat. I will ask the secretary to display the item so that the fellow members can review it before voting on adding it to the agenda. So this is a letter from the city clerk, and the summary is that the clerk's office have received notice that Blanche Mawasagi has resigned from the Aboriginal Affairs Advisory Committee effective October 18th, 2021. Staff from the IAO and Public Appointments Secretariat in the city clerk's office currently leading process to recruit applicants and help bring nominated candidates to the city council for their consideration in order to fill a number of vacancies on the committee, etc. So I would like to move to add this to the agenda as new business. All those in favor, please raise your hand. Any opposed? The motion carries. So with the new item that was just added, that means there are 7 items on our agenda today. The first item is AA14.1, and I will pass this over to Brian. Thank you, everyone.
What's up, good? So good to see everyone. Item AA14.1 is the Indigenous Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship, a step along the long road of reconciliation. This is a staff report with recommendations. Michelle Baptiste, Project Manager, Economic Development and Culture, and Tobias Novogrodsky, Director, Business Growth Services, Economic Development and Culture, will give a presentation to the committee. When you're ready, Ms. Baptiste and Mr. Novogrodsky.
Wait, Misko Bengish from Quaidesh Nakas Makwado Dem. Traditional name Red Sunset Woman. I'm Michelle Baptiste, the project manager for the ICIE. And it's great to see you all again. I will be sharing my screen for our presentation. But before I do that, I just wanted to say that it's great to see you. I did have the opportunity to introduce myself when I started with the city in September last year. We're all very excited about the strides that we've made with the ICIE since then. So, can everyone see that? Is that a yes?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yes.
Now, just so I'm clear, is it taking up your whole screen, or is there?
Sorry, this is the host. I apologize for the interruption. To the presenter, if I could please ask that you go to display settings at the top and switch the view. Right now, we're getting your view. So we're seeing the slide presently and the next slide that you'll be going to.
See, this is what I was afraid of.
Oh, but if you click on display settings right there to the near the top there in the middle.
Okay, yes.
and then swap presenter view and slide view. So now we see the entire first slide.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for your help.
You're welcome.
Okay, so as you are, okay, now what am I doing? There we go. As you are aware of the ICIE and the history of how it began, this slide really just highlights the background again, that the process started in 2012 through Councillor Christian Wong Tam's in Ward 13. There was a feasibility study done in 2013, and that really highlighted a lot of what the Indigenous community in Toronto, their needs are, and what they'd like to see within service providing for Indigenous businesses. Councillor Wong Tam began working with the city in 2013. She acquired 200 Dundas Street East as a potential location for a business center and incubator, and it is now the future home of the ICIE. The last time that I spoke with you, we had Section 37 funds. They were insufficient to build the center, and so the funds have been topped up to 7.85 million for capital to actually construct and build the center. So in the space development, the ground floor, you can see the photos here of the fins have been installed on the outside of the building. The ground floor retail space is approximately 4,800 square feet. The event space and meeting rooms on the second floor is approximately 11,000 square feet. And the incubator space on the third floor, which will be a build up, is around 6,800 square feet. So the total gross floor area is going to be 22,500 square feet. And there's a photo of the building itself, the condominium building, and then from Dundas Street, the fins that have been installed. So we do have a visual presence there currently. So throughout this process, you're aware, and I know that there's a couple of folks on the Aboriginal Affairs Advisory Committee that are also on the Leadership Advisory Circle that the city put together at the beginning of this project. And nobody anticipated that they would be required to, for so long, but we all know why we're meeting remotely, and same reason why we got so many delays. But in terms of the governance model of the ICIE, which was really the cornerstone of the operations, and the LAC advised us that we wanted to have an Indigenous-led entity to operate the center that has the skills and experience necessary to operate, including entrepreneurship and property management, because that's a large square footage property, so that having that knowledge of property management is really important. That is able to use Indigenous ways of governance and exercise independent decision making, and is chosen through a transparent selection process. So, pardon me, early in the spring, I suppose, early summer, we had decided with the support of the LAC to go through an request for information process to see what's out there, how many organizations are interested and have the capacity to potentially operate the ICIE. And the point was to see if there was requisite interest, and then we would decide on what the next step would be. So the LAC reviewed the responses and the staff, and it was determined that there is a sufficient number of Indigenous-led organizations with the capacity and interest in serving as the operator for the ICIE. And it was recommended that the city proceed with an open competitive process to select an operator for the ICIE. So currently, that is that is where we are currently at. I will wrap that up. In terms of the ideal operator for the ICIE, it was also decided that it has to be an Indigenous-led, not-for-profit. A successful track record of working with Indigenous community, entrepreneurs, innovators, and businesses. Demonstrated success in attracting private and government partners as other modes of revenue generating and sponsorships and whatnot. Appropriate governance model proposed as well. Strategic business plan proposed. A strong plan to ensure continuous engagement with Indigenous entrepreneurs and innovators, and a high level of organizational capacity. So that was agreed upon through discussions with the LAC and with city staff, that these were all points that are going to be very important that the operator needs to bring with them. So currently we are at the stage where we're starting to draft requests for proposals. We will be engaging LAC members who would like to participate on a selection committee with city staff to help draft the RFP, launch it, socialize it, review the responses as they come in, potentially interview proponents, and then make a recommendation of who the operator for the ICIE should be. So that concludes my piece of our presentation. I'm going to turn it over to Tobias now, and he will brief you on the staff report. Miigwech, for your time.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And next slide, please. And so over the next couple slides, and good afternoon, committee members, I'd like to highlight three main components of the staff report that is before you. One component relates to how this report endeavors to challenge the colonial relationship between the City of Toronto and Indigenous people. So I want to speak about that. The second component is the financial impact of the ICIE and the recommendations that relate to further investment by the city in Indigenous economic empowerment through the ICIE. And then lastly, I want to highlight the four main substantive recommendations in the staff report before you so that you can see them in their full glory and have a full understanding of what we are recommending. So to begin, this report does deliberately attempt to challenge the colonial relationship between the City of Toronto and Indigenous peoples in a number of different ways, including by making explicit references to the calls to action and key findings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as well as the National Inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So there is explicit discussion about the key findings of those really important works and the connection between them and those findings and the intent and the purpose of the ICIE. As Michelle has explained, this staff report is explicit and directly recommends that the ICIE operator be Indigenous-led. So that is a core and central recommendation of the staff report. I think this report, as you will see if you've had a chance to read through it, really centers and highlights and puts a spotlight on the incredibly important role and contribution of the Leadership Advisory Circle, the Indigenous residents, elders, and entrepreneurs who've been working with city staff on this project over several years now. And there are examples in this report of how the advice from the LAC has been taken to heart and acted upon, and is reflected now in the core recommendations before you and included in this report. And lastly, this report includes an explicit recommendation about an ongoing partnership relationship between the City of Toronto and the future operator of the ICIE that will be based on mutual respect and Indigenous autonomy. So those are key elements of the staff report. Next slide, please.
Oops. I don't know what I'm doing here. Sorry about that, folks. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Thank you, Michelle. So on this slide, we want to highlight some of the key components that are included in the staff report's financial impact section. And they are as follows. As Michelle did explain, the money for the building of the facility has already been committed by the city and is available. It's up to $7.8 million, and that's for the actual building of the ICIE space itself. So that money is secured through Section 37 funds, and we're confident we have the funds available to build the facility. As noted here as well, the other sources of funding for the ICIE project to date are twofold. One is a contribution agreement over 5 years with the Federal Economic Development Agency of Southern Ontario, FedDev Ontario, for up to $5 million. That's been providing funding for the operating costs of the facility to date through what we characterize as the startup phase for the ICIE. And it's a 50-50 cost sharing agreement with the federal government and the city. And the city's portion of the funding to date for this project has been made available through a reallocation of existing resources within the budget of the Economic Development and Culture Division. So that's what's been happening to date. However, as indicated in the staff report, and if you kind of see in the bullets in the chart below, the operating costs for the ICIE over the next couple of years go up quite significantly. And because of that, there is a recommendation in this report that there be, through the coming year's budget process at the city, new funds committed by the city for the matching of the federal government money for the continuation of the project, the ICIE startup phase, for the next couple of years. And so that amounts to close to $3.3 million. So that's the next step in the city's financial commitment for this project, is for the balance of the startup phase of the ICIE. And then looking longer term, this report also recommends that it is really important that there be a long-term, stable, predictable city funding contribution to the core operations of the ICIE for a host of reasons: to strengthen the center's ability to attract third-party funding, to advance Toronto's economic recovery in the wake of COVID-19, and significantly and explicitly to represent what we would characterize as being a generational investment by the City of Toronto in Indigenous economic empowerment. So there is an explicit recommendation in this report that, again, through the coming year's budget process, a long-term funding contribution and commitment be made by the city. And I'll speak more about that in a moment. So next slide, please. So lots of text on this slide, but we wanted you to be able to see explicitly the 4 main substantive recommendations in the staff report. And I'll speak to each of them in turn. So the first one really deals with governance. And as Michelle has explained, the core recommendation here through yourselves and then onto committee and council would be that the city select an Indigenous-led organization or consortium to serve as the operator of the ICIE and identify that organization through an open, competitive solicitation process supported by the Leadership Advisory Circle. So that's the first core recommendation about the governance and operation of the ICIE going forward. The next recommendation, recommendation 2, really is a recommendation that gives city officials the authority that we would need to be able to enter into a series of agreements with the future operator of the ICIE. And I want to point out two pieces here. The first is that we would have authority as city officials to enter into long-term agreements. So not for a year or 2 or 3 years, but for up to 10 years. And that these agreements reflect and be based upon those principles of respect, consultation, and cooperation between the city and the operator of the ICIE, and draw inspiration from the two-row wampum that upholds Indigenous autonomy. So that's the long-term ability for the city to enter into a long-term respectful relationship with the future operator of the ICIE. So that's the thrust of that second recommendation. The third recommendation is an endorsement of the goals and elements of the ICIE program model, which is outlined in the staff report at a high level, which is to provide culturally safe space, connection, supports, programming, and resources for Indigenous entrepreneurs and innovators, and to be an entrepreneurial resource center by and for Toronto's Indigenous community. So staff are seeking support for that recommendation in terms of the high-level core goals and elements of the ICIE program model. And then lastly, here's the direction for the Economic Development and Culture Division to seek explicit funding for the next two components of the ICIE through this coming year's budget process. So the first piece being the matching funding from an operating perspective for the startup phase of the ICIE between 2022 and 2024. And then a long-term financial commitment on the city's part to cover a reasonable share of the ICIE's annual operating expenses for a period of not less than 10 years. And that's the generational investment in Indigenous economic empowerment through the ICIE that is recommended here. So those are the core recommendations of the staff report. It's been a privilege for city staff to work with LAC members, city councillor, and others developing these recommendations for this committee's consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Baptiste and Mr. Novogrodsky. Before proceeding to questions of staff, Councillor Kristen Wong-Tam is here to speak to the item. Welcome, Councillor Wong-Tam. Please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to Michelle and Tobias for their presentation. I think they summarized years of work and dialogue and planning and consultation in a few minutes. And I want to just pay a particular attention to the fact that this work would not have been possible without the leadership of so many that are that contributed to the development of the proposal that's before you today. But I wanted to, and it's going to be almost impossible for me to single everybody out because it's literally been now almost 9 years that I've been involved with this file, and it will be literally impossible without excluding a few folks. But I do want to highlight those who were absolutely critical in making this advance forward. I'm going to start from the community, to be quite honest, in the ground up. Pamela, I see you on the screen. It's nice to connect with you here. You had two extraordinary predecessors that sat in your role. Crystal Mellon, her previously married name, and Sarah Mandanik from the Native Women's Resource Center was one of the earliest partners that came forward from the community that said that this was going to be a transformational project if we can get it off the ground. And I want to just especially pay note to the fact that it was actually women's leadership in the community that talked about finding a path towards economic reconciliation, specifically in light of what was happening with murdered and Indigenous missing women, how to ensure that there was a place of financial resilience for everyone, especially women and girls. So I want to start there because it was literally those conversations early on with the Native Women's Resource Center that really catapulted what was a spark of an idea to what we have today. And I know that there were so many others from the community, whether it's Ms. Wabik or perhaps Anishinaabe Health or Council Fire. Through the years, it was literally an accumulation and a building of work. And so I want to say thank you, first and foremost, to the local community that works in the heart of Ward, what was then called Ward 27. Toronto Centre, Rosedale, and what is now known as Ward 13. And from there, I'll tell you that it was an extraordinary journey because we did work very collaboratively, and although we didn't have a roadmap, one of the challenging things of creating an Indigenous, to be quite honest, any incubator or accelerator is that there is no roadmap. And it's very few blueprints out there to do this work. But it really had everything to do with the power of collaboration and people coming together. Those who are not on the screen, but I want to just say thank you to them. They would be including Chief Hill from the Six Nations, as well as Chief Laforme, who was really active and engaged in the conversations with us early on, in making sure that there was a dialogue that we continue to engage in some ways. by text messaging or what have you, just to let them know that this is continuing to proceed. I was really quite moved by the thinking that it's not an exclusive Toronto project, despite the fact that it sits in Toronto, but it had to have a reach outside of Toronto. And the leadership from both Six Nations and the New Credit certainly highlighted that for us in the early years of development and conversation. The other thing I want to note that the project was almost a humbling experience because by all accounts, as you see the rapid development of the city of Toronto, and much of that development sits in the downtown core. Councillor Layton represents a good chunk of it. I represent the downtown east. I recognize that 17 different development proposals contributed to the collection of Section 37 funding, which then manifests to a final sum of $7.85 million to build out the space. But the value of the real estate is also sitting at about $20 million. And that, in many ways, was also a body of work that came from the local community itself. So when we started off to endeavor to push forward for this proposal, the question was where would the money come from, but also where would the real estate come from? Interestingly enough, you need to have space to build it, an incubator, and never in my wildest dreams would I have imagined that we would have something as large as this. To the point that it is now going to be the world's biggest Indigenous incubator and accelerator. And I think that we should be very proud of that. But it was a tremendous community lift, and I wanted to just highlight that because I think we cannot forget where it originated from. The other thing is that I want to say thank you, and a big thank you to the Economic Development staff. As well as, of course, the Indigenous Affairs Office, led by Selena Young and now Michelle Baptiste. When these two remarkable women came on board and decided that this was going to be a project that was going to really have the full-on support of the Indigenous Affairs Office, it really made a huge difference when they took the helm of it. And in particular, I want to say thank you to Michelle. You've been absolutely stellar to work with, and so has Selena and her team. Like, I am going to impart upon the Affairs Committee here that you have an incredible team at the City of Toronto that is truly dedicated to making this not just a project, another project at the city, because we do have incubators, whether it's the fashion incubator or the food incubator, but there is a real steadfast and heartfelt determination that this has to be so transformative that it actually changes the conversation, not just locally, but regionally, nationally, and internationally, and that's a strong commitment, I believe, from the team that's here. The folks on the screen, you folks have an incredible amount of work ahead of you, and I don't want to take up too much time, but I do want to say thank you. The first time this matter appeared before council officially was in 2018, 6 years after it began the discussions in the community. And Larry and Francis, I remember that we were, and Andrea, I remember that we had talked about what would this look like with the community support, and those conversations were largely out of the city hall. It was literally in the community, and so the first time this matter appeared before council was right after the Aboriginal Affairs Committee endorsed the ICIE as a Smart City Challenge in 2018. It was like literally the first time it actually appeared on the agenda. So I want to say thank you, because even though it looks like it kind of magically appeared, it's literally the conversations and the partnership in the community that made this happen. And although it may not be wildly and broadly documented everywhere, it could not have happened without this committee. And the fact that you leaned into this in 2018, when I came to you and Todd Ross, from the Métis Council moved a motion and said that you wanted to support the idea, where we took it to the federal government and submitted ourselves as a smart city challenge. And although we were not successful there, what has now happened is that I think we got a better outcome, to be quite honest, a stronger outcome, an outcome that actually has deeper roots, and an outcome that I believe is going to speak from strength to strength, simply because the space is owned. It's going to be properly designed and installed and constructed, and then ultimately led by an Indigenous led team that is going to do all the programming, animation, and to build from there. And then finally, to my colleague and friend, Councillor Layton, you have been steadfast, and very quietly ushering this along and giving us lots of words of encouragement. Thank you to you and your extraordinary leadership at this committee, and just being an incredible champion at City Council, because I'm sure you will all know that Mike does a lot of work in making sure that City Council understands how important the community aspirations and needs are, but also that the strength of the community is always on full display when Mike speaks about the work that this committee does. So thank you to each and every single one of you for the opportunity today. Miigwech.
Nakamik. Thank you, Councillor Wong Tam. Members, do you have any questions of the councillor on this item? If so, please raise your hand or unmute your mic to let me know. Not seeing anyone. Members, do you have any? Oh, hi. Yes, Mr. Frost, go ahead.
Yes, just one question. I didn't hear anything mentioned about board of directors. Will that be coming along later? Or will it be a board of directors?
I can answer that, Larry. So we had discussed with the LAC members, there were two options, actually. Pardon me. We decided to put out basically out a request for information to see if there was interest within the existing Indigenous organizations and capacity to become the operator. And if there was not, and we took all of those responses back to the Leadership Advisory Circle, and if there was, if they had deemed that there was not enough, or the responses weren't strong enough to go to the RFP, the request for proposal stage, then we would go down that road of creating a new not-for-profit and recruiting a board of directors. So there were both of those options, and given the high level of response from the excuse me, from the request for information, the LAC supported the city going forward in a request for proposals process.
Thank you, Michelle. Just a second question, Michelle, maybe you can answer. Was it mention of rental income? Do you have a forecast for that, or is that just something comes later?
Well, I think maybe Tobias can help me with this, but the first and foremost is to get the operator on board. The operator, however they decide, however they decide to govern the center, they will have that opportunity to make those decisions. So the ground floor retail space, it will be up to the operator to decide how they want to use that space, how they will generate revenue, and so on and so forth. So that's the idea behind that. The city is not prepared to, nor do we want to, make those types of decisions, as it's not going to be a city-operated facility. It will be Indigenous-led. So it's up to those folks to make those decisions.
Thank you, Michelle.
My pleasure, Larry.
Thanks, Larry. Steve, go ahead when you're ready.
Okay, yeah. I haven't really paid much attention to IC as it's referred to, but it seems to me a 10-year operating agreement, that seems like incredibly long, particularly if there's governance issues or other issues that may arise with the operator. That seems like an incredibly long time. I was wondering, what's the rationale for determining a 10-year operating agreement? And why not other options like 3, 5 years? Why 10?
So through the chair, thank you for the question. So what is recommended in this report is that authority be provided to city officials to enter into an agreement with a term of up to 10 years, but it wouldn't necessarily follow that there only be a single 10-year term. So as you're suggesting, it could be the case that the structure of the agreement could be an initial 5-year term with an option to renew up to 10 additional 5 years, that kind of thing. So those types of details would be sorted out when we get to that stage of the process of negotiating a final operating and service and funding agreement with the selected operator. What's sought at this time through this report is that ability to have an agreement for a term of up to 10 years. And coming with that comes the predictability and stability of being able to have a long-term relationship and make those investments on the part of the operator and on the part of the city. And that's the parallel recommendation for there to be city funding made available long-term for a reasonable share of the operator's operating expenses.
Just a follow-up question. Yeah. So these recommendations have to be approved by city council, and I'm just wondering with city council if that's something they would likely do. And I can see city councilors arguing this is a blank check for 10 years, and I think that it'll be voted down, and that's it, gone, right? So I'm just wondering, maybe I'm a little skeptical here. That's all. Not trying to come across that way. I'm just trying to ask some practical questions and gain some better understanding. So, so my question here is, does this require city council's approval to cover operating expenses for the term of whatever the arrangement is?
Yeah, so through the chair, yes, city council approval is required for the authority to be given to city officials to enter into an operating and funding agreement. And that's the authority that would be requested through this staff report. And then the funding itself would need to come and be approved through next year's 2022 budget process for the longer term funding.
Thank you for that. And I have to apologize. I'm seeing now that Dr. Schiffer had his virtual hand up in the corner of his screen. If everyone could just use their real hand, because it's really hard to tell across our backgrounds. And Francis, I saw your hand as well. You can go right afterwards. Thank you.
I'll use my real hand next time, Brian. Thank you. So exciting to see this come to fruition. I just had some questions. I like the fact that it's not entirely focused on Toronto, and that it will provide opportunities for Indigenous entrepreneurs and innovators from across Ontario and perhaps beyond. I also recognize that a significant investment to make this possible is coming through the City of Toronto through funds that should be poured back into the Indigenous community in Toronto. Not all of the funds, obviously. And I'm just wondering if there are any thoughts or if there are any mechanisms or how many of these opportunities are going to be geared towards Toronto, folks in Toronto, because we do have a large emerging population of Indigenous youth in the city that needs opportunities like this, and how much of it is focused on opportunities for folks outside of Toronto. Is that too far in the weeds, or have we kind of thought through some of that at this juncture? Miigwech.
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. So obviously the bricks and mortar are in Toronto. The staff that will be working within the ICIE obviously will be given, Indigenous folks will be given priority for those jobs. The center itself physically will be open to any Indigenous entrepreneur or innovator, even community member in Toronto. And the center, as it's being built, there's state-of-the-art technology being built within the actual walls of the center so that programming can be offered across Canada, well, really anywhere. So given how much we've advanced, even just since the pandemic in terms of meeting virtually, learning online, all of those things, the center will be equipped to be able to provide that type of learning and those types of programming outside of the city of Toronto, throughout Ontario, across Canada. But obviously the center itself being located here, the predominance will be given to, obviously, Toronto Indigenous folks.
Okay, just as a follow-up comment, I think that's great, and I think that as you know, as an operator is selected and as the project moves forward, it would be great to develop sort of like pipeline and referral processes to whether it's Toronto Council Fire, Native Canadian Center, or Native Child organizations that are supporting youth and young adults to look for these kinds of opportunities. It would be nice to bring those folks into the circle and define pathways. Yeah, be great.
Absolutely, yes.
And I apologize again for the wait, Francis. Go ahead when you're ready.
I don't mind waiting. I think it's terrific. Any initiative that is First Nation, Métis, Inuit, Aboriginal, Indigenous focused is good. It's good for the city. But I, like Steve, have not been involved with an awful lot of this. It has moved forward at a bit of a snail's pace at the beginning to where it is now, to where it's going to council for approval. I'm just curious on what the Aboriginal Affairs Committee, what you need from us. I mean, you've moved it forward with City Council and the Indigenous Affairs Office moving this down the road, and we have not been a very substantial part of the whole process. So why is it coming back to us now at this time?
I can do my best at giving you some answers, and then maybe Selena might like to also say something. But as you know, when I came on board, I had a chat with you guys just to introduce myself and talk a little bit about what I knew at that time about the project, which wasn't very much because I was shiny. In terms of the Aboriginal Affairs Advisory Committee, I do know that Selena has been updating you guys on the ICIE as things have been progressing. And in terms of what we're looking for from you is, a parade. Just kidding. No, is A, for your awareness, and B, for your support, because you did, this committee did support the ICIE as Councillor Wong Tam had related to back in 2018. And so that we can take this staff report to executive and then to City Council with being able to confidently say that the Aboriginal Affairs Advisory Committee has participated in supporting this staff report.
Okay, you say that Selena kept us updated on it, while TSN keeps me updated on the Leafs too. So, I mean, to have an update is not as substantial as being involved in the development, the infrastructure, putting all this together. We were not part and parcel of that. We were supportive when it was the big project that was going to go out that the City of Toronto applied for, did not get, but applied for it. And we were in support of that at that time. So we have not had the opportunity to do that with this. We've been told where it's going and how it's going to get there. And that's all from City Hall. The different parts of it. So that I'm just asking, what is it you need from us now at this late date?
Well, I will answer that, Francis, in that I wasn't around when the Leadership Advisory Circle was formed, and that the purpose of that LAC was to do exactly what you're talking about. So there have been, Andrea has been on that committee, Angus has been on that committee. And so, there was an opportunity for people within the community to speak out, and Jeffrey was on that committee for a while, for quite a while. And there was opportunities for folks to put forward their desire to be on the LAC, which was the mandate of the LAC to do exactly what you're talking about. And I don't know if, you know, Celine, you want to say something else, or Andrea, you did one. I'm sorry, I'm not sharing. My apologies.
So was there someone else who wanted to follow up with an answer to that before we get to Andrea's question? Or are we good?
I can say just a tiny bit, Brian, if that's helpful. Co-chairs, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
So building on what Michelle said, Francis, your valid questions. I mean, Councillor Wong Tam mentioned this too. Updates have been coming to the AAC since before the Indigenous Affairs Office existed. And Michelle talked about the LACP. So one piece that I wanted to focus in on to try and provide clarity is what the city is looking for from the Aboriginal Affairs Advisory Committee at this point is the recommendations, endorsing those recommendations that Tobias went through so that we can go to City Council and get approval to put out a request for proposal for proponents to operate the Indigenous Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship, as well as the additional recommendations that were on that slide.
Thank you. And thank you for waiting, Andrea. Go ahead when you're ready.
Okay. Just a couple things. I think I first of all I want to acknowledge Steve as well as Francis and Larry and Jeffrey, because you know there was a time when we agreed through the task table that we would go to initially sit on there. When we sat there in our earlier conversation to see why is this taking the route that it is, and I'll recall your memory too as well, Jeffrey. We said we could do this ourselves. How does this work? This is a great initiative. How do we look at how does this work for the community? It's right in our neighborhood. How do we ensure that the people that we serve actually has access to? And Selena, at no time have you ever come to any table to brief us. So I want to be clear on that. So I'll speak to that then. Thank you for raising that. Whether it was before or after the IAO, that was not the case. I think this is a really inappropriate time to be coming to our table to ask for endorsement recommendations. I would move to accept it as an update because people have not, and we did step off for a reason. We did not see it being reflective of the community, especially within the area that we're part of. How does this meet the needs of those individuals who are on the streets, many called houseless, but are also our artists? You know, how do we ensure that this is great? It's an innovative initiative that we're looking to support. And we talked amongst ourselves, bringing it back to the task table. You know, how does this work for the community as a whole? You know, so I'm prepared to accept this as a report only. And I think it's unfair to expect it to come back for some endorsement from this particular body, and so you can take that back to full council. So those are my comments.
Thank you for that, Andrea. Are there any other speakers to the item, by the way? If you wish to speak, you can raise your hand or unmute your mic to let me know. Yeah, Larry,
yeah,
go ahead.
Just last one question that's been really on my mind is, do we have ownership of this, or who owns this? Or are we just under the umbrella of that building?
Larry, hi, it's Kristen speaking. I would say that the real estate at this point in time is owned by the City of Toronto, because the City of Toronto was the signatory to every single Section 37 agreement, including the one at 200 Dundas, and the 200 Dundas lands were deeded to the city. So it was actually through those negotiations that we were able to secure the land, the building, then also the additional dollars to do the leasehold improvements and the design and the construction. So the asset itself at this point in time is owned by the city. It's important to note that I don't know where it will be in the future. because there are many times where city does start off with the ownership of the land and we may convey it. We're doing that with perhaps some of the Housing Now initiatives, TCHC properties that are now being sort of redistributed through third-party nonprofit operators. It's largely how it began. I'm not sure if that's where we'll be in 10 or 15 or 20 years, but at this point in time, very simply, because it has to be held by somebody, that entity is the City of Toronto. If I can just, maybe lean into some of the questions, which I think are very legitimate. When the LAC was constructed, the Leadership Advisory Circle, there was an open call to largely many community members, including, I believe, members who would have sat on the Aboriginal Affairs Committee over the years, because literally we've been at it for some time. I recall that I actually had gone to early meetings of task to present the concept, because we were just circulating and sort of socializing the idea. And the staff attachments that you see here with either Selena's office and Michelle and Tobias, it came much later. So the resourcing and the body of work early on would have been done in conversation and community, which is what I was advised by the community itself, that don't bring City Hall out to us, start with conversations. And then later on, we started to formalize and build up the capacity to really do the work, because it's so challenging and difficult. So if there's anybody who is to, I guess, wear the responsibility, if I haven't been in touch, regularly, it would be myself. I will wear that, because it was specifically a request from the community that we don't bring government, to the conversations without building the personal relationships first. And it was a lot, to be quite honest. This is a huge, enormous project to get off the desk of one councillor. So I just want to say that much to help hopefully at least explain where if there's any shortcomings. It could have been myself asking, Councillor Layton, I want to come and talk to the committee. I'll be happy to present, even if it's just basically to say, this past quarter, I would have met with these 12 organizations and had conversations with various leaders without any paperwork attached to it, because I spent years in dialogue with the various chiefs, and to be quite honest, I drove out to the different nations to speak to them about their aspirations and what can happen in Toronto, and they were not always formally recorded at their requests.
Thank you, Christy from Larry.
When you're ready, Francis, I see you.
It's titled A Step Along the Long Road to Reconciliation. Unfortunately, we're being told what the recommendations are, and we're not being asked. So reconciliation is not really happening at this point.
Sorry, y'all. I'm just waiting for an update from the clerks, because I see that in order to accept this, because it does have recommendations attached, that would require a motion. But I know that Andrea said that she would also like to move to receive this as an update, which would, I guess, discard the recommendation. So I'm just waiting on clarification from the clerks on that. Thank you for your patience.
So I'm working with the clerks right now to reword a motion to honor Andrea's note and to acknowledge some of the recommendations and feedback given by primarily Steve and Francis. So while we draft that, I think it's safe, if there's no other speakers or questions, that we can move on to the next item. In the interest of time, while we draft a motion, and after the next item, we can put it up if we are complete with the wording, if everyone's okay with that. Okay, so the next item is the Indigenous Heritage Engagement Project with Gary Medema, Project Manager, Heritage Planning Services, City Planning, and they will give a presentation to the committee. And so I will pass over the floor.
Thank you.
There you are.
Hi, and I believe Clerks is going to put up the presentation so I can walk through that with you this afternoon. And I think it'll be about 10 minutes. So we'll try to keep it brief, and that way we'd love to have a conversation with you afterwards as well. While the presentation is coming up, I'll say my name is Gary Medema, and I am a project manager. Oops. Oh, you can still hear me? Okay, good. Thank you. I'm a project manager with Heritage Planning, which is a unit within City Planning. And I am here today with Samantha Jagir, who is an Indigenous Youth Research Associate. And Samantha will say hi later on and speak to a couple of slides as well. And this project has also been working closely with Jeff DeHont of the Indigenous Affairs Office, who has been a big support and a part of the project team. Wayne Reeves, also from Museums and Heritage Services, who was the chief curator. He's since retired from the city. And we have Alex Abdichuk, who is also available to speak to any questions that you might have today from the museum side. So with that, we'll launch in. Next slide, please. So again, thank you for your time and interest today. We would like to introduce this idea of an Indigenous Heritage Engagement Project, which has been developed to date through a co-development dialogue. And we want to bring it to you at this early stage before we have really put any bones onto this. We come with ideas so that in the next phase, we can begin to put things into action. So that's where we're at today, and we're looking forward to your feedback and input on what we've heard today and where we'd like to go. Next slide, please. So a bit of background, the idea for a distinctive engagement project for Indigenous communities in Toronto came out of a city planning initiative to do a citywide heritage survey, and I'm going to speak to that in a second. And in conversations with the Indigenous Affairs Office and Jeff DeHaan and Selena, it became really clear very early on that an early and key component of this project would be a distinctive Indigenous heritage engagement piece. And so that idea found its way into a report to council, which endorsed the whole concept of the citywide survey. And it was, and then we joined with Toronto History Museums because they were also interested in engaging with Indigenous communities about their heritage in the city. So this has become a key goal for this project, is that let's find ways of making sure that others within city planning who, and perhaps beyond, including obviously museums who are interested in asking questions about Indigenous heritage, how can we work together to ask those questions once in a way that will serve all of us and respect the time and energy of the Indigenous communities that we'd like to work with? So that was the key goal, and I'll speak to further moving forward. So next slide, please. So a little more on these two programs so you understand the background. Again, I'm with Heritage Planning, and Heritage Planning's key task is to both identify and then conserve properties with cultural heritage value in the city of Toronto. And we were thinking about how to do this citywide in a really proactive way. And again, that's what spawned the idea of clearly we're going to need to engage with communities across the city to understand what they value. First, we should engage with Indigenous communities to understand what they value as heritage across the city as an input into our process. I'm guessing that you're all familiar with the Toronto History Museums. They were obviously interested in co-presenting Indigenous stories and learning from Indigenous communities what those stories might be and how to co-present. So we came together for those two reasons. Next slide, please. We launched then into a co-development process, and and we decided early on, and again, thanks to the Indigenous Affairs Office for guidance here, to not do what's been done in the past, which is city staff come up with a project, send out a call to say, hey, come and talk to us, gather the information, and then go away. What we wanted to do was to co-develop this. So our first question as a part of this co-development dialogue was, we try to be transparent about, here's our goals, here are the programs, and this is why we're looking to engage with Indigenous communities. Are those goals and those needs appropriate for Indigenous communities, right? Do you see value in what we're trying to do? And if so, how can we think about making sure that this engagement process also contributes to goals of Indigenous communities themselves? Let's make this a partnership. Let's develop it together so it can serve everyone and not just the City of Toronto. Then we worked again to think about how could we develop and deliver such a project? What would that look like? So now we'll look at some of the outcome of those conversations. Next slide, please. So we had 2 co-development dialogue meetings, and we worked with the Indigenous Affairs Office to organize these. And again, thanks to them for their help. One was on December 5, 2019, and another was on June 22. And I'm happy to say that Brian Winter, you were with us, as was Senator Suzanne Burnell for these 2 dialogues. And so here you have the list of people who were there. I should say they were both also planned and facilitated by Bob Goulet of Nibissing Consulting. And it was with Leah Horzempa of, I think, Sister Circle Consulting as well, who contributed. So we had Pauline Shirt as elder. Larry, you might remember we were at the Native Canadian Center for the first meeting and sat in a circle in that space and started with Pauline. And then we had, of course, Mississauga's the Credit Nations and the Journal Wendat with us. The Métis Council, and that was, of course, Senator Burnell, the Toronto Inuit Association, and then other organizations, of course, that are important within the city's Indigenous communities. And then also representatives on the right-hand side, Indigenous Programming Advisory Group from within Museums and Heritage Services. So this was a body that was already formed and working with museums to help them inform their education programs, so we invited them as well. So this was an attempt to gather a reasonably sized group to have a good conversation that could set this hopefully on a right road and to receive advice and input from them. Next slide, please. So what we heard at that first meeting was, yes, there's value to this kind of engagement project if it's Indigenous-led and hears, listens, receives to stories of First Nations and Métis people in their voice, in their authentic voice. So it was clear that we as the City of Toronto are not editing we are receiving the stories in their authentic voice. Capacity funding, of course, was mentioned, may be required to support participation. That engagement must be broad, so there's emphasis on the diversity of Indigenous people within the City of Toronto and the need to make sure that this program is finding appropriate ways to speak to all of those aspects of the Indigenous community. And then the timeframes must be flexible so that we can meet the needs of Indigenous peoples. We have to, again, de-bureaucratize, decolonize this process to make sure that it's, again, developed with Indigenous people and serving them. Next slide. Again, a bit more of what we heard was, of course, the importance of elders and traditional knowledge holders, right? There are many people within the First Nation, Métis, and Inuit communities who have the skills needed for this program, and we should fund them and speak to them. And the idea was put forward of a steering group for this project that would be made up of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit individuals representing organizations, perhaps, within the City of Toronto. Honorariums and travel expenses, of course, would be an important part of this, but also that facilitation should be done by a knowledgeable facilitator from First Nations, Métis, or Inuit organizations, known and respected by the community. Next slide, please. the second meeting, so we got stalled with COVID in March, and we had to postpone, and then we met via WebEx, which was challenging, but we managed to make it meaningful. We heard a little bit more about this idea of a steering circle, with the number 13 being proposed for the 13 moons, if I'm correct. And that steering circle would inform the engagement strategy and process. So their key job would be to help us make sure that we are speaking to the people that we should speak to and that we're doing it in an appropriate way. So focus very much on the engagement part of this conversation. Secondly, it was identified that we should have a knowledge keeper circle of up to 7 representatives, and that was tied to the 7 generations, to advise on when we receive stories and knowledge and understandings, how do we understand what we hear, and how do we then also use what we hear, and to make sure that that we have knowledgeable First Nations, Métis, and Inuit advice on that piece. Obviously, the need, again, to use an Indigenous historian to coordinate the research with Indigenous communities and making sure that Indigenous communities, again, are telling those stories themselves. And the engagement should be led, again, by someone known and knowledgeable within the Indigenous communities. And then not only capacity funding, but gift giving. And I think that's an important piece in the bottom to say that just as we started at the Native Canadian Centre with ceremony, it was clearly understood that this process would reflect, include, and be shaped by First Nations, Inuit, and Métis culture, right? That would be embedded in this process. Next slide, please. So since the final dialogue, of course, we processed the results, and then COVID knocked us sideways. And in the fall of 2020, and then through the beginning of this year, we managed to pick up the threads, develop and improve a budget for a next phase. So we're prepared to move forward. And then we were, again, very excited to participate in the Indigenous Youth Research Associate Program and to hire Samantha Jagir to join us. And she has been helping us since April with this program. And Samantha, did you manage to connect? Just want to...
Oh, yes. Yep, I'm here.
There she is. Okay, great. So Samantha, you can take it from here.
Fantastic. Hi, everyone. Yes, I'm Samantha Jagir. I'll just quickly introduce myself. I'm Anishinaabe from the Thessalon First Nation in Northern Ontario. I recently graduated from the University of Toronto, where I studied Indigenous Studies and Archaeology, and I've now been with the city for nearly 6 months, working on this project and others. And I'm really grateful to be a part of this meeting today and to be able to hear from you all afterwards. So just continuing on with the updates here, we also continue discussions with the IAO and other city projects to ensure coordination of Indigenous engagement efforts across the city. We've heard often that Indigenous communities are repeatedly approached by the city asking the same questions, and we want to try to minimize that. One such project is the Municipal Comprehensive Review, who you heard from in June. We've been speaking with them, and just really we're looking to take on that responsibility of being aware of what our colleagues are doing to improve how we engage with communities. Next slide, please. So here we have our next steps coming up. The first is to procure an Indigenous engagement specialist at the end of 2021. This came right out of the recommendations mentioned before. This person will organize and facilitate the steering circle and knowledge keepers circle. They'll inform the approach to conducting historical research with Indigenous communities. And this, exactly how to conduct and collect this research is currently still undefined, and we're looking to the knowledge of both the engagement specialists and our advisory circles to help us shape this as we move forward. And that also applies to the development and delivery of an engagement strategy to gather Indigenous knowledge, which will then lead into our other next step of the launch of the public engagement program at the beginning of 2022, where we will be able to go out and hear from communities and begin that part of this project. And that'll be all for this slide, unless Gary had something to add as well.
No, I don't.
Perfect. Next slide then. Thank you. And then finally, we just want to say thank you for your time today and for listening in about our project. like I said, for me, it was great to be able to sit in a circle today and meet all of you virtually, and really look forward to any questions or thoughts or comments that you have to share with us. So thank you, Miigwech.
Thank you both so much for your presentation and your time today. To the members, does anyone have any questions on this item? If you do, please raise your hand or simply unmic. Okay, seeing none, are there any speakers to the item? Okay, so do I have a motion to receive the item? Francis, all in favor? Any opposed? The motion carries. Thank you so much. I will just quickly check in with the clerks to see if we have something to present on the screen or if we need a little bit more time and we can carry on to the next item.
I'll sneak in and say thank you all very much. Greatly appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Madam Chair, we're still working on item number 1, so we can proceed to the next item, please. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, clerks, and thank you, Gary. I can't believe that was over 2 years ago now. Unreal. The next item is item AA 14.3, new tools for protecting local culture. Sorry, Patrick Tobin, Director, Arts and Culture Services, Economic Development and Culture, and Mariana Mota, Policy Development Officer, Economic Development and Culture, will give a presentation to the committee. When you're ready.
Thank you very much, clerks. And thank you to the committee for allowing us to join you today to present some preliminary work on our cultural districts program. As noted, I'm joined by Mariana Mota from the Economic Development and Culture Division, as well as colleagues from planning, city planning, such as Gary Miedema, who's also associated with this project, as this is a joint effort on the part of EDC and city planning. If we could go to the next slide, please, Mariana. So slide 1, there it is, just lays out the areas that we intend to present for you today. Mariana will be taking you through the majority of the presentation, but before she does, I just want to outline a few key points. So next slide, please, Mariana. So with respect to our purpose in joining you today at your table, the first is for us to share the preliminary information around proposal for a potential cultural districts approach in the city of Toronto, and to seek your advice, both in terms of processes we build out an engagement to build a broader understanding of Indigenous history and self-determination through local place keeping and place making, but also to ensure that we establish a future touch point with this committee prior to our path to City Council, both November 9, but also ultimately in June, when we intend to present a report with actual recommendations regarding any program. I'll note again, it is pretty preliminary. Before I pass to Mariana, I'd like to note too that the framework that we are going to present to you today arises from very specific pieces of council direction spanning now back more than 2 years with respect to threats to local neighborhood character, principally in Toronto. And this has been the Church Wellesley Village, downtown Chinatown, Gary Avenue area, and particularly Little Jamaica. However, while we have responded with targeted initiatives in each of those locations, there is a need to take a more comprehensive approach that can address issues of the threats to local character across the city. However, I wish to note for this committee, it also presents a significant opportunity to embed Indigenous heritage, presence, and placemaking as the foundation onto which ideally we build any of the mechanisms to support culture. And in our work, we recognize that all of Toronto is Indigenous land, and that we hope that this effort will be a way for us to support self-determination, truth and reconciliation more broadly, and the work of the AAC and the Indigenous Affairs Office to develop a reconciliation action plan for the city. So at that, I'll pass to my colleague, Mariana. And again, just thank you for entertaining us here today.
Thank you, Pat. So I will just reiterate a few important considerations before we move forward with the presentation. Just a second, okay? So first of all, work is in early stages, as Pat mentioned, and it is to respond to existing council directions we will go through during the presentation. And it's also important to mention that there is currently no district program in Toronto. Through this work, we aim to develop a program in a way that reflects the unique context of Toronto. We acknowledge that there are no specific areas that are more or less cultural, and we do recognize that the entirety of Toronto is Indigenous. And again, through this presentation, our goal is to hear your advice and your recommendations. You're going to be very, very valuable to help inform our next steps and ensure that outcomes are meaningful for Indigenous communities. So the reason why we are working on exploring what a cultural district program may look like for Toronto is that in early 2020, a motion by Councillor Wong Tam indicated the need to support 2S LGBTQ+ small businesses and cultural spaces. Later in 2020, Council approved two motions on supporting Little Jamaica and Black-owned and operated businesses in the area. It was also around that time that the on Indigenous placemaking was presented by the Indigenous Affairs Office to you. More recently, a motion by Councillor Layton directed the Economic Development and Culture Division EDC to identify ways to protect Chinatown's cultural identity through a cultural district plan or another mechanism. And in July, Council directed EDC to explore how to best support the potential of Geary Avenue as a creative community hub. And of course, as you all know, in terms of timeline, it was in March 2020 that a formal declaration of municipal emergency was announced by Mayor Tory because of the pandemic. So going back to the motions, they emphasized specific areas as meaningful hubs for diverse communities in Toronto and for Toronto in general. Here you see images of Church and Wellesley, Chinatown, Little Jamaica, and Geary Avenue. And they highlighted issues related to protecting businesses and promoting tourism, protecting culture and heritage, and also to fostering a sense of community. More specifically, combined, they indicated the need for a coordinated approach to protect areas and communities from displacement, to ensure spaces promote a sense of belonging, and that they also celebrate communities and the history of neighborhoods beyond built farms. So to explore what that coordinated approach could look like, we worked on a jurisdictional review with the goal of learning how other cities responded to similar challenges, and we also led some early engagement. Through research, it was possible to see that cultural districts have been widely used. Many cultural districts and already in the United States alone. Upon an initial scan, further research was undertaken for 9 cities, selected based on having an officially and established recognized cultural district program, and also considering factors like population density. And among research findings, it was noted that some cities have been proactive in embedding Indigenous history and programming, at times prioritizing artists identifying as Indigenous across cultural districts, which is the case of Minneapolis and Baltimore. Others, like Sydney, Australia, made sure to promote Indigenous businesses also across different cultural districts. And there is also the American Indian Cultural District in San Francisco, which was the first in the United States dedicated to celebrating Indigenous legacy, culture, and contributions. And the district leads a number of activities to protect and to promote awareness on Indigenous history. In terms of early engagement, what we heard during this very preliminary phase was that it's important to recognize the history behind some areas being meaningful for communities, which has involved factors like safety, sense of identity, and sense of community. It's also important to ensure that government support is not limited to those districts, but to support them as meaningful community anchors nonetheless. Acknowledging and targeting the root causes of displacement like affordability and community ownership have also been mentioned. And the last point that you see here is that the cultural district program should be seen as a placemaking methodology. So it's really to make sure that it's up to the community to lead and to advance their own priorities. As of today, there is no coordinated approach that does that in Toronto. And that's why to address this gap, we are exploring the idea of a cultural district program. It would be a combination of tools to protect small businesses and cultural spaces within community hubs. And not only would it address common themes, identified emotions, but it would ensure effective use of resources at the city, because we will not be working on a series of one-offs, but creating a process. It's supported by best practices and research findings, and will also be informed by engagement meetings and by your advice recommendations today. So we are currently completing this preliminary phase with a preliminary report that recommends that a cultural district program be created for Toronto and that tools be identified to be part of the program, also ensuring that the program reflects Indigenous communities' priorities. And phase 2 will be about identifying the final recommendations through broader engagement, which is why it's so important for us to hear from you today. Your overall feedback is very welcome. And specifically, it would be very important to hear your thoughts on what you think should be considered for a cultural district program to be of value for Indigenous communities, and what you see as important steps for us to take during the public engagement phase to work with Indigenous communities and ensure that the program reflects reconciliation and Indigenous communities' priorities. So thank you all for your time and for listening, and we look forward to your advice and your guidance today.
And thank you, Mr. Tobin and Ms. Moda, for your presentation. And Mr. Tobin, I think you can understand that we do like things to come to this table in the preliminary stages. So that's appreciated. Members, do you have any questions of staff on this item? If so, please raise your hand or unmute your mic to let me know. Bueller? No one? Nothing?
Yeah, right here. Right
Oh,
here.
here's Steve. Go ahead,
hand.
Steve.
Yeah, I read the report prior to the meeting, and it sounds really interesting. I was just wondering, is there any specific neighborhoods that are in mind for being designated as an Indigenous heritage neighborhood? Or can we just put a placard all across the city in every single intersection and say this is an Indigenous heritage neighborhood? I'm for the latter, but being serious here, are there any specific areas within the city that you know, are looking to be designated as such?
I'll start. Thank you through the chair, Mr. Keegans, for your question. I'll start and turn to my colleague, Mariana. No, this is quite a preliminary stage. The work really has only been initiated in the last couple of months, really accelerated in the last month. So we wanted to benefit from your advice to build out what that consultation could look like. We have a draft staff report that was attached, where actually recommendation number 3 has us, EDC, working with the Indigenous Affairs Office to consult with the Indigenous community about what expectations for such a program would be. So we take your advice. We are conscious that there have historically been conversations in the city that are site specific, but at this point we are not making any assumptions about what should or should not be a specific Indigenous cultural district. I'll just see if my colleague Mariana wishes to add anything.
So I think that Pat actually mentioned the key points when it comes to that. It's preliminary, and at this time we're really looking for key considerations to keep in mind when it comes to next steps. And also, I would like to highlight that we are looking at creating a process, right? Something that is transparent for the city. So it's not about going to specific neighborhoods and just designating your Indigenous neighborhood and et cetera, et cetera. It's absolutely not about that. So that needs to come from the community, and we understand that. So at this time, it's really about key considerations, and the goal is creating that process for the city and for communities.
Excellent, thank you. Any other questions of the members? Councillor Layton, when you're ready.
Yes, thank you. And
I see you too, Francis.
It's more just a very quick comment. I know that Chef Joel from Nish Dish at one point in time was looking at trying to create a cluster of businesses at the corner of Christie and Bloor, and then was quite successful in actually executing on what I think could be considered about 24 murals, Indigenous artist murals, around both the Bickford Center, not a city site, and across the street on at Christie Pits. There's also a medicine garden at Christie Pitts now. I was really excited about it, not only because I'm the local city councilor, but I also live around the corner. So one of the challenges, though, and Nishtish has since closed that location, but one of the challenges for attracting more Indigenous businesses, as I'm to understand from Chef Joel, was that the availability of space and the cost of space. Many of the businesses were startup. So if we are going to initiate a program like that, Native Child and Family Services, I should say, also have a location there. So it wasn't Nishtish in isolation, but in order for us to build out, in particular, I think an Indigenous district in the city, we will need to have some resources to do that, in my opinion. We will need to dedicate some resources. We could do that through things like maybe there's some fun IMET crossover or tax relief that can be factored in, pre-qualified for some kind of tax relief, or maybe there's a space offering. Maybe there's some kind of subsidy for a certain amount of time for in the space. So I just think there are some unique areas of the city that could do that. I should also add that we had a discussion with a couple organizations on this committee and the community associations around the corner of Spadina and Bloor, because with the Native Canadian Centre and Wigwaman, and 3 of those corners going to be redeveloped in the next sort of decade, including one of the corners I hope to be dedicated Indigenous housing, with whom we don't know. We don't own the site yet, but I'm trying to acquire it from the province for the purpose of Indigenous affordable housing. There's an opportunity there. There's also a deep history there of a gathering place on the southeast corner of Spadina and Bloor, as well as Spadina, the word itself. So I put those 2 plugs in, but I realized they're both Ward 11, and that's horribly. There's no conflict of interest, of course, but it's a little greedy of me to try to suggest that it be there. It's also not my place to say where. I would just say that those 2 things are in the works, and maybe they can feed into your discussion, wider discussion across the city. Of course, it would be welcome in both those locations.
Through the chair to you, Councillor Layton, thank you. And I want to pick up on one of the points that you made. This is not about simply creating an honorific program. This is about trying to create a framework within which we can bring tools to bear that can help preserve and promote culture. So and you've mentioned many of them that are under consideration now, and we'll look to the community's wisdom too about what have proven to be the most effective and where the gaps are and what we should look at.
I do know that there's in San Francisco, I believe in their Chinatown, there's like a rent supplement program that exists for Chinese businesses that are feeling the pinch of gentrification. I think they're established businesses, though. I don't think it qualifies for new business. But given the historic crimes against Indigenous people that the settlers did in this country, and what was stolen from the Indigenous community, I only think it fitting that perhaps it also should be a support for new business opportunities. And I believe that would be entirely consistent with the calls to action for truth and reconciliation.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And Councillor Layton, I really appreciate your optimism. Just keep saying things out loud publicly as often as possible, and they're guaranteed to come to fruition. Francis, you had your hand up when you're ready.
Yeah, it was along the same lines as Councillor Layton, particularly at this time when COVID has forced a number of businesses to close. There is an inordinate number of vacancies available. This would be the time for a small business to move in. And when they move in, there would be a more dense number of Indigenous people in a specific area. And that can only help define a community. I look at your council direction and your 4 pictures there, the Chinese area, the LGBTQ, 2S, and all the rest that I've forgotten area. And the Black area, I'm not sure what the other one is, but is that just because of the density of the people in that area, or was it predetermined in some way? Because we've not had the luxury of being able to walk in and buy places and move into a neighborhood and become the primary inhabitants of that place. So I think in light of COVID, and I think in light of the city's guiding principles to work with us and the availability of locations, I think this is an opportune time for us to take over again.
Through the chair, thank you for your comments, Francis. There were a couple of questions there, so I'll try to catch them. Why these particular images and communities? This was just tying back to specific direction the council had given us to show what the starting point was, but where it needs to go to be relevant, to include all the points that you've made about Indigenous land. And then to the small business, you're right. We are hosting an Indigenous Entrepreneur Symposium. I believe it's the 26th of October. Forgive me if I have that date wrong. But this work proceeds in parallel, hopefully supporting Indigenous entrepreneurs across the city with finding place, selling product and services. And so these are hopefully complementary efforts. I'll see if Mariana or Elena wanted to add anything I missed.
Not really. I'll just take the opportunity to thank you for all the points you raised specifically about the cost of space, both cultural Leighton and to you, Francis. That's something that is just so important when it comes to this work. It's so foundational, and we will for sure take that into consideration. And when it comes to the question about why those areas, I think that Pat already covered that in his answer. But we are joined by my colleague, Elena Bird, who is co-leading this work. So I'll just see if she wants to add anything.
I think this is a great discussion and very welcome feedback from the advisory committee. And I think that there's really an opportunity here too to think about that idea around that all of Toronto is Indigenous, and how do we ensure that this cultural district program really embeds and is founded in that, so that we're thinking about Indigenous placemaking throughout the city. So I'm very curious to hear the committee's thoughts on that as well.
Makes me think about Vancouver, and I know you spent some time there, Pat, as well, and like the way that they developed Stanley Park with the Indigenous village there, and the way that there are like distinct places. Like, I think Indigenous entrepreneurship and business is one thing that's important, and I'm very supportive. So back up, this plan's exciting. I'm very excited to support it. I think the business side, the entrepreneurship side is exciting. I also think there might be opportunities for like reconciliation-based tourism, where people come to spend money, feed into economic recovery, learn about Indigenous culture in ways that are supportive. So I would hope that maybe that would be threaded into a little bit of this as well. Yeah, just wanted to add that. You betcha.
Through the chair, thank you for the comment, Jeffrey. I think you're right. Francis, your colleague, has noted that there's certain trends with respect to the pandemic and recovery that we need to be conscious of. And some of those are negative and some are positive. In the case of Indigenous placemaking, I think and Indigenous tourism, it feels like there really is momentum that has to be factored in here. And one thinks, when one arrives at Vancouver Airport and sees Bill Reed's Spirit of Haida, you know what territory you're on. And so it's good to hear conversations in Toronto to try to address that clear absence.
Thank you for that. And I did see that Mr. Larry Frost had his hand up, and after that, Tracy King as well. So when you're ready, Mr. Frost.
Yeah, it's just food for thought, because we have a business incubator now in Dundas, and what came out of the corner there we've been talking about. Again, how can we, since we were not involved in a lot of discussions, how can we get involved in creating a business corner there, and that could be a cultural hub for Indigenous people, Métis and Inuit. Again, just an idea. I thought, you know, if you have one area where the business, the small business and the big business are, you could make one big cultural area for First Nation meeting anyway. That's just an idea of mine. Thank you.
Through the chair to you, Mr. Frost. Yeah, thank you. And that does feature the ICI's plans at the corner of Dundas and George. It's really intended to communicate with the Indigenous Placemaking Initiative being driven by the reconfiguration of that street, which can afford opportunities for ceremony, for performance, and ideally with the at-grade retail space, opportunities for entrepreneurs to be able to sell as well. So your thinking is very much being taken to heart by that team.
Thank you. Thank you. Patrick, rather, thank you.
And Tracy, I don't see you. Are you still with us? Your audio is not coming through, Tracy.
To the chair, this is the host. It appears that Tracy, the phone line Tracy was using to connect to the meeting, has left the meeting. So her audio is back to the way it was before the meeting began. I'll attempt to call Tracy, Member King, back into the meeting. One moment, please.
Thank you. Are there any other hands I'm missing right now while we wait for Tracy to get back on the line? There's Francis.
Yeah, sure.
Me. Go ahead.
A couple of words, and to give me space, I'll speak. In support of Larry's idea of the IC building at on Dundas, that would be almost impossible to turn that into an Indigenous community just for the high cost of land, real estate at that area. So just because you put a Hudson Bay store down on a corner doesn't make that a Hudson Bay cultural area. So just by having the IC on that corner does not make it a culturally based area. So unless you're willing to give away the other three corners to Indigenous businesses, it's going to be difficult to turn that area into a hub just because of the cost of the land, which is why I'm thinking about all the closing of the stores and retail and businesses in other parts of the city.
Through the chair, those are all excellent points, Francis. And we don't mean here to overpromise. The advice you're giving us is really important for us to bear in mind and make sure that we do not overpromise to community and underdeliver. That's a significant consideration for this team.
Yeah, we've heard that lots of times before, and yeah, don't do it.
Hi, Suzanne. I can see that Tracy's back, but I don't see her additional phone. So Suzanne Brunel, when you're ready.
Thank you, Chair. My feeling is that there should be a presence scattered throughout the city, not just localized at a specific corner or what have you. Because the entire land, as we said before, is Indigenous land. And like in my area, I'm way up in the northern part of Toronto. I would dearly love to see more visibility, Indigenous visibility, signs of, First Nations presence in this area. That's my thought.
Thank you, Suzanne. And Tracy, your phone is working. When you're ready, go ahead.
All right. Do you hear me now? All right. Okay. I just wanted to relay the importance of cultural districts. I know are important because I've seen a few when I've been in the States. However, as Francis had stated, we haven't been to that level where we've had a cultural district because we've been so we're everywhere throughout the GTA. There's different pockets of us, and we're not just we just don't have like certain neighborhoods or like Chinatown where our communities all lay. But when you're looking at certain pockets, like you definitely the Native Center and Wigwam and Terrace is one area that's that you can notice, as well as Council Fire on Parliament area. There's another group of Indigenous community members that frequent that neighborhood, but so those are ones that come to mind right now. However, I just wanted to make sure that we're also considering those other areas such as the Peel, such as to the North Brampton, as well as to Scarborough now, where Gabriel Dumont stands. So there's areas where there could be potential cultural districts, and they are identifiers as well. So I just also wanted to bring light to that some community members may be open or receptive to being in the spotlight per se, but others might think of it as unsafe for them. And we also have to make sure that the community, the Indigenous community, wherever you consider to bring a cultural district, that they're aware of, what the positive aspects are, but what also could be, unsafe aspects for the community members there. And we also have to, for instance, there's areas, especially with women and girls, with the fact that many of them have undergone, have left family violence situations where they may not want to be identified if they decide to go into subsidized housing, which most of them will have to do when they're leaving their spouse or partner who has been abusive to them. So there's a lot of factors that need to be considered in those kinds of things. But I think that if you strike some type of advisors to assist you in trying to figure things like that out, like with the Native Women's Resource Center, for instance, or with Council Fire, et cetera, or with Native Child and Family Services, but also be aware that there's different Aboriginal Affairs members here who have also that lived experience, and they also work with different Indigenous peoples that, for instance, like myself, that work for a university, that have worked in our Native community organizations might also play a role. So that's all I want to add, and I'm so happy I was able to talk. But thank you, and that's all I have to say. Miigwech.
Through the chair to you, Tracy, I do want to respond to some of the really important things that you said, and I'll turn to my colleague, Mariana. But everything you said has been borne out as well by the research, and I just want to pick up on a couple of the ones. One, it can't be a one-size-fits-all set of tools. There's got to be the flexibility to work with the community the way the community wants to be recognized. Number two, displacement born of colonialism, economic violence, physical violence is a factor that needs to be considered in. And three, as you know, safety. Safety has to be paramount, psychological safety, physical safety. And so that thinking will be carried through this work, certainly. And I'll turn to my colleagues to see if there's anything they wish to add.
And before, sorry to jump in here, Elena and Mariana, before you go ahead, Tracy, can you just make sure that your phone is also muted? Okay, go ahead when you're ready, phone.
Mariana or Elena, I don't know if you wish to add to that.
Yeah, so just want to thank you for everything you said. It was so important, and I also want to stress what Pat mentioned in terms of it not being a one-size-fits-all type of solution. most of the cities we looked at actually that had successful programs, they had a set of tools when it comes to the program, and then it was up to the community to decide what tools to use and how to use them. So it could really be about their priorities and considerations related to that community in that specific area. Elena, anything you want to add to this?
Thank you again for the comments and just that the idea of an advisory committee or working alongside the Indigenous community in Toronto as we work through this would be really, really helpful. We would invite that opportunity and look forward to connecting back with you on how to best shape that work and engagement.
Excellent, and thank you. Members, are there any speakers to this item? Beyond what's already been said, I know there's been some pretty good dialogue so far. Okay, not seeing any and hearing no further speakers, do I have a motion to receive the item? I am seeing Larry Frost. All in favor? Excellent, thank you. The motion carries. Pam, you're up.
The next item we have on the agenda is item 4, the Digital Infrastructure Plan, considerations related to bias, discrimination, and Indigenous data governance. So Alice Zhu, Manager, Connected Community, and Hamish Goodwin, Management Consultant, Technology Services, will give a presentation to the committee. Welcome to the table, and you have the floor.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're really grateful for the opportunity to speak with you this afternoon. We're going to bring up a presentation shortly, and the purpose of the presentation is to give you an overview of the digital infrastructure plan. We'll walk you through the plan and talk to you about why we believe the work is important to Toronto residents, businesses, and visitors, and what it needs to move forward in creating the city's digital future, and looking for your advice as well. So an outline of today's discussion is we'll talk a little bit about the plan. We'll talk specifically about bias, discrimination, and data governance policies, and we'll walk you through the public consultation work we've done as well. So the team that's leading this work, we are called the Connected Community Team. We're situated in the Technology Services Division. And so I'd like to just let you know that, we shifted our team name from Smart City to Connected Community in 2019, after we worked together with about over 20 city divisions to really think about what it is that we wanted to achieve as a city around technology. So we landed on the term connected community because we think it better encompasses our goal, which is how to leverage technology and data to improve and increase quality of life for everyone in the city. So this is the work that we are focusing on, and part of the reason we are moving forward with this digital infrastructure plan. So we recognize that digital infrastructure is changing the way that we deliver municipal services. So, for example, the way that we're communicating today, in this circle via WebEx, and it's leading to a number of positive outcomes and better management of public assets. So as the use of digital infrastructure increases, a policy framework is needed to ensure that we have consistent decision making to address emerging issues, such as digital rights, digital equity, etc., which we'll get into a little bit deeper in a moment, and to bring clarity to everyone. So to bring clarity and certainty to residents, other stakeholders, to businesses around the kind of digital future we want to create here in Toronto. So we're doing all of that work through the development of the plan. The image you see here is, some some of the things that you may associate with technology and a smart city in our urban environment. The city's infrastructure is evolving to not only include those traditional building and physical assets like roads, sidewalks, water mains, city planning efforts, etc., but also now including digital infrastructure components. So just want to share a couple of real life examples in a moment around what that means. We define digital infrastructure quite broadly. Anything that exchanges data and information is digital infrastructure in our definition. So things that you might think about are things like Wi-Fi, sensors, apps, open data, like data itself, policies around data, etc. So all of that is considered in the digital infrastructure plan. So some examples are on the left here, you see this automated vehicle, a shuttle that's running now in a trial in Toronto's East End. Maybe you're familiar with the parking app. I certainly use the Waste Wizard app quite a bit to figure out the Toronto Waste app to figure out, what day is recycling and what should I do with this burnt chicken or something like that. We also want to share with you an example around a digital canopy, a free Wi-Fi program we've launched over the pandemic to provide free public Wi-Fi into some of the Tower neighborhood buildings. So, these are all the things that you may want to keep in mind as we discuss the digital infrastructure plan a little deeper. So finally, before I hand it over to my colleague Hamish, how does this plan affect me? So why should you care about this plan? So we know that digital infrastructure and technology in general is not a neutral tool. So when we're not deliberate and make a concerted effort in this area, technology can replicate the harm that we see and inequities that we see in the physical world. So we believe that creating a digital infrastructure plan with that equity lens can help create a society that will support more inclusive and accessible benefits for everyone in our city. And it can also prevent the harms around things like potential cyber attacks, potential privacy breaches, and other harms to the community. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to my colleague Hamish that can get a little deeper into the plan. Thank you.
Thanks, Alice, and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks again for your time this afternoon. So again, the DIP is an opportunity to build on existing policies and standards that we have at the city, but also to address emerging considerations such as digital rights, equity, bias, discrimination considerations that Alice mentioned. There's also an opportunity to develop formalized governance around decision making, and that includes Indigenous data governance. And we're going to come back to that later on in the slide. The plan itself is formed on 6 principles, and I'm going to go through them at a fairly sort of light touch in recognition of your time and the level of detail that is required and time to go into these things. So the first 5 principles you see on the screen have been adopted by City Council, and the 6th one, digital autonomy, which I'll talk about shortly, was added more recently. The plan uses those 6 principles as organizing elements. So there's a chapter for each principle, and then there's descriptive text and associated policy areas and policy statements. So I'll show you, this is an example of the first principle for equity and inclusion. Each principle has a vision statement. The vision statement is meant to be visionary, as opposed to, for example, just restating the status quo. So we see the opportunity for digital infrastructure to be used to create and sustain equity, inclusion, accessibility, and human rights in its operations and outcomes, and that it can be used to be flexible, adaptable, and responsive to the needs of all Torontonians, including Indigenous, Black, equity-deserving groups, and those with accessibility needs. On the right-hand side, we've identified 3 policy areas to further explore that vision statement, and the associated policy statements which we have identified to sort of action those visions, that vision statement, and make it come to life. These are just a selection of those 19 policy statements for equity and inclusion. So for example, you can see it takes a strong stance by saying the city will do these things as opposed to the city may, as though it's going to be a compliance-based plan as opposed to voluntary. So we're looking to, ensure that communities facing systemic barriers and discrimination will have access to affordable internet and connectivity, and that includes access to internet-enabled devices, supporting digital literacy for residents, and also ensuring continued access to non-digital public services, making sure they remain available for people who cannot or choose not to access digital services or access the internet. The next principle is a well-run city. This is a more internal focus principle for the city and the Toronto Public Service. So it addresses things like digital transformation, data governance, digital literacy. So in this case, we're talking about digital literacy for city staff, asset management, and so on. So for some of these, I haven't got example policy statements. I just wanted to focus on those related to equity and bias. So we're going to move on to the next principle, which is social, economic, and environmental benefits. This principle is focused on leveraging digital infrastructure to create a society that supports equity and equitable and inclusive benefits, whether for social, environmental, or economic prosperity. So an example of this would be through the city's procurement program, which aims to create jobs, increase supply chain diversity, and drive economic growth. Next up is privacy and security. This principle recognizes that with the process of digital transformation, the Toronto's digital infrastructure must be positioned to address potential cyber attacks and disruption of critical systems and potential privacy and security risks to individuals. And so the DIP includes specific policy statements to protect the privacy of residents and prevent against misuse of data collected by the City of Toronto. So a couple more to go. Democracy and transparency recognizes the city's role in building trust in digital services and infrastructure that support our community. And so this can be done in a variety of ways, including by ensuring that human rights, principles of privacy, freedom and expression, and democracy are incorporated by design into the city's digital infrastructure. Ultimately, we recognize that there's a lot of work we can do to help build trust and confidence in our digital services. Some examples include developing a registry of sensors that are used in the public realm so that people sort of understand what they're doing and how they are relating or interacting with them. Another example is developing, in a similar vein, a registry for AI, so artificial intelligence, so people can see how AI is being used at the city. And if they like, they could gain insight into the algorithms that are being used as well. So just some other examples in relation to democracy and transparency, looking to ensure fairness and transparency in the procurement program, making sure that residents can easily access and understand information about the city's digital infrastructure, why decisions were made and why it's important to them, for example. Fostering responsible, accountable, and human-centered, transparent and explainable AI, so artificial intelligence, are some other examples. And then finally, I mentioned digital autonomy. So autonomy itself refers to the quality or state of being self-governing, and this implies a level of control and independence. So thinking about this in the context of local government, technology, and data, this principle is about ensuring we collectively, essentially are in control. So control comes in many ways, and the ones we've identified are noted on the right-hand side in the policy areas. You see the 6 policy areas on the right-hand side, and these address things like vendor lock-in, interoperability, and how residents understand how their data is used. And you can see a sample policy statement about control on this slide. So the city will institute mechanisms to help residents understand and better control the use of their information or their data. While we're talking about control and digital autonomy and sovereignty, I also wanted to note that our work plan does include considering how principles of Indigenous data governance and methods of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis engagement and guidance in how data is collected, protected, used, and shared. the First Nations principles of OCAP, so that's ownership, control, access, and possession, provide a model for the city's approaches to Indigenous data governance that we're looking at, and we'll be doing that work in collaboration with partners from a number of divisions, including the Indigenous Affairs Office, People and Equity, and so on. And for those of you that are familiar with the data for equity strategy, there's obviously some overlap there that we're associating ourselves with. In terms of next steps, we have been doing a series of consultations the past month or so, and certainly we're here to talk to you and hear your feedback, and I've got some discussion questions at the end. In terms of what this looks like on the journey to developing the plan, we started around 2019 by starting off with those 5 principles that I mentioned at the start. We've done a series of consultations leading up to this point where we are right now with the Gold Star. We'll be looking to take a report to Council at the start of 2022, and then implementation of the DIP would take place beyond that time. So that's the presentation. I know the DIP addresses many complex issues, so it's okay if you didn't get a chance to take it all in, and we can talk about that in more detail if needed, or we can come back and present to you if there's interest at another time. But at this point, we're interested in our consultation journey to understand a few things and pose a few questions from you. So, for example, how can we build upon the policy statements to ensure issues of equity, bias, and discrimination are appropriately addressed? What elements should be considered as we develop a digital equity policy? And then back to the principles of OCAP, are there key groups or organizations that you think we could meet with to examine how to integrate that type of model into an Indigenous data governance process at the city? So I'll just pause there, and at the chair's discretion, I can leave the slide up or take it down.
Thank you, Hamish. I'd appreciate if you could take it down, just because it's not possible to see everyone here.
Sure.
Please let me know, members, if anybody wants to put it back up, and we can certainly do that. So, okay, Tracy, I already see your hand when you're ready. We can't hear you. Nothing.
Really?
Oh, there you are.
Tracy, we hear you now. Sorry, you just muted yourself. I'm going to unmute you. Now, if you could say a few words.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
So as you know, I have IT issues today, but just by viewing your presentation, and I don't know about other members here on the Aboriginal Advisory Circle, but I would need a 101 course just based on everything you you presented, and to make recommendations or comments just based on the presentation when some of the concepts and the terminology are things that I'm not familiar with, and that's where I stand right now. But when it comes to when I see things like intellectual property, when I see things like government control, and then I see equity mixed into it, it's a big issue. And when you're an Indigenous community member, when you see government control and you see drivers towards that, it just, it's kind of unsettling. Like, I would need to know more about the subject matter before I even make any comments or recommend at this moment. That's just, I like the update that it's coming because it's, a part of our future. But that's where I stand right now. Good.
Dr. Schiffer, when you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dense information, thank you. And certainly lots to go through and lots to reflect on. One thing that struck me as I was reading through it that might help us kind of tease out some of the work that could apply to the Indigenous community and be informed by the Indigenous community is maybe making a separation. I noticed you have the equity, diversity, and inclusion banner, and then you've got kind of Indigenous folk nested within there. Increasingly, we're encouraging folk to sort of have equity and diversity as one pillar and reconciliation and Indigenous folk as another pillar, just recognizing that, you know, Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution and the TRC and a bunch of other stuff creates a bit of a unique and separate and a distinct context for Indigenous people that is different from equity-seeking groups. And when we do that, I think it encourages us to think a little bit differently and to reflect on, you know, the importance of, you know, Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination and data. And, you know, that's what leads us to like the OCAP principles for Indigenous data governance and the rest of it. And so I think that maybe making room for some further conversations and partnerships that could potentially inform the development of a distinct Indigenous piece on this could perhaps be helpful. I don't know, but I just wanted to make that suggestion. Miigwech.
Thank you for that.
We have a response on that from anyone? Or are you just taking that into consideration?
Oh, yeah, sorry. Didn't realize I was not on mute. Just saying thank you for those comments. Certainly, yeah, firstly, I'd like to acknowledge your comments as well as Tracy's. Thank you for that as well, Tracy. Point well taken. I think we can take both of those back, and I you know, to Tracy's comments, if you would like to have further briefings, we can do that. And to Jeff's comments, I think that's a great point that we can look into as well. Thank you.
Yeah,
thank you, Ms. Zhu and Mr. Goodwin. Sorry, go ahead, Alice, when ready.
I apologize. I just wanted to say that, yeah, it's a really great point, because we do recognize that this is a different conversation than an equity and inclusion conversation. We fully recognize that. It's been difficult trying to get all the things that we want to talk about into these 6 principles, so I'm sure you appreciate that as well. And to Tracy's point, I understand that it's a lot of information, and I'd love to talk to you about it some more if you're open to that. And I thank you in advance for your time. And one of the things I wanted to mention is, when we talk about government control, just so you know, in that autonomy context, is more about how the city isn't beholden to like a technology vendor. That's what we're talking about. So that, you know, when we want to, you know, use the software the way that we want to, that we're not sort of tied into that solution. It's not about control over people, it's over the contracts that we have and the type of technology that we'll be using. So just so that I give that context, but lots to talk about, and we would be very grateful for that opportunity.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And Andrea, I see you've unmuted. You can go ahead when you're ready.
Thank you. And thank you for the presentation, Alice, as well as Namish. Appreciate that. I was thinking about both, and I appreciate the presentation that was just done now. And I'm thinking, wouldn't it be great to get you together with the cultural district concept, you know, and to see how you can work together and rather duplicating. Council Fire is located in the Dundas Parliament area, and what would be great for where we look at police reform, we look at safety, we look at the well-being, and if the digital for me would be amazing, not only connecting us, because the broadband ends at Berkeley, so we don't get all of the abilities, you know, the connections. It'd be great, and appreciate that there would be that technology available for our elderly. It'd be great to have you connect up and around the safety, the risk management, to ensure that the lights all come out at one time and very bright. It would be really critical to ensure that there's ability to track initiatives, because just watching CP24 along with, you know, CDC, there's constant abuses, there's constant you know, mugging and killing, and I think so. Utilizing this particular strategy as a tool for, you know, for protection and safety reform, I think there's a lot to be said by this. I'd love to make sure that, you know, all of our households throughout all the cultural districts have a safer world, right? And I appreciate that, I didn't follow everything, but first thing that come to mind is the safety and the discussions. I'd love to have a conversation, not solely just for Council Fire, but to have a conversation on some of those issues that could basically assist us. We've come through, well, we haven't come through it yet, but COVID and where a number of the angst are. So allowing and providing our young people, allowing the opportunity to do signage, allowing to perhaps have partnership with Pattison signs so there can be some messaging. There's a whole number of areas that we can rely on. And what we're doing is we're transforming our signals, our smoke signals, and in transferring it to make sure that it works for the entire city, and that it is a safer place, that it allows us to digitize the cultural spaces that are within every one of our streets, and that allows us to inform the newcomers, old comers, and individuals out there. So there's a lot to be said in terms of joining forces with the former group. So I appreciate the comments that you've made, but I got so much from this, then also with the fire, but I was just trying to say, how does it fit? How does it fit? How does it meet not just the Indigenous population, but how do we ensure that we're here for the community collectively for the safety, well-being, and that you have that, and you'll have a really strong city in all aspects. And I appreciate Yellenko. There were no questions; those are my comments, and I'm hopeful to connect up and have some more thoughts. And Yellenko, Tracy, you're right about those areas that we need to look at. Primarily, are the women that we have, that ensure that when they're leaving, they are safe in all aspects, technology-wise, and connecting up to Toronto Hydro. So, anyways, Yellenko.
Andrea, thank you for that. And did Alice or Hamish want to reply to that, or?
I can start. Andrea, thank you so much for the comments. It's nice to see you. And I think some of this came up, I think one of the last time we spoke together with Theo, and some of the, the strategy that we can apply technology to. And I think you hit the nail on the head. That's the point of the digital infrastructure plan. It's like, how do we not just do technology? How does it actually create benefits for everyone? So that's exactly the kind of thing we're thinking about, right? Like that street light, instead of just being a street light, can it be a little bit more? Can the technology be leveraged to create more safety in the community and give people comfort in another way? So that's what we love to continue the conversation with you for sure, and understand specifically for the community that you're talking about, and have that conversation about how to use technology to not just for the purpose that we were originally thinking about. How do we use that a little bit more? How do we expand that benefit?
And I see that Tracy King has her hand up. Let's try this. Host, would you be able to unmute Tracy's phone?
Trace, sorry, one moment.
And remute her computer, sorry. There you
Tracy,
go.
I am now unmuting your phone.
Can you hear me now? Now you hear me? Yes. Oh, okay, wonderful. So I just wanted to, when Andrew was talking about the seniors, it just, it made me think of my son's involved. He works for Native Child and Family Services he's a senior mentor, and he helps with the IT. So he helps the seniors with how to use their cell phones, how to use their desktops, how to troubleshoot, and how to buy software, what the software is, what the names of them are, like the real basics, right? And so programs are out there, like the one at Native Child and Family Services, where they have programs for the seniors, and even at I believe at Wigwam and Terrace, that all the seniors have their own iPads. I don't even have an iPad. So our seniors need to be connected to community. They need to be connected to their families, especially, economically. They're disconnected to their families because, their families live up north or wherever, and they live in a city. They have to be close to medical facilities and so forth, hospitals, see doctor specialists, because elsewhere, outside of a big city like Toronto, you don't have those assets that you would have in Toronto. And I believe that over the coming years that we're going to have a lot more Indigenous people wanting to come to Toronto for different reasons. Could be health related, education, employment related. And if we had a way of connecting our community to each other through methods such as what you talked about, digital, and safe ways of doing it, and to inform our community about the safety of things, because I know with even with Toronto Police Services and Aboriginal Peacekeeping Unit, there, some of our community members have crimes against them because they don't know the digital or internet alarms or alerts that they should be aware of. So, yeah, definitely, I could see the safety in it. I just wanted to add that. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you, Tracy. And do we have any additional questions? I don't see any hands right now. Any questions, comments? I'm not seeing any. So we do have a draft motion that came from the clerks. Clerks, would it be possible or for the host to put it up on the screen? Thank you, Jonathan. So just in case you can't see it, it says the motion is that the Aboriginal Affairs Advisory Committee requests the Chief Technology Officer to incorporate the committee's feedback into the work on the digital infrastructure plan. Do I have a mover? I see Pam Hart. All right, everyone. So we have this motion approved. All those in favor, please raise your hands. All right, across the board. Nakamik, thank you. And Pam, I think you have your motion ready from earlier in the meeting. Is that correct?
Yes, thank you everyone for your patience while we pulled that together. So just referring back to item 1, the ICIE presentation. So as there is recommendations on the agenda before the committee, there is still the task of the motion to adopt the item and the recommendations. So I'd like to put forward a motion while considering the notes and the feedback that were provided. So I'd like to put forward a motion, which we'll put on the screen, to amend the recommendations to add an additional point. So we'll put that up and then I can read that out loud for y'all. I almost said y'all, I meant for you all. Okay, so that the Aboriginal Affairs Advisory Committee recommend that the City Council direct the General Manager, Economic Development and Culture, and the Director of Indigenous Affairs Office to report regularly on the progress of the Indigenous Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship to the Aboriginal Affairs Advisory Committee. So the amendment is adding this to the other recommendations. So that's the motion on the floor.
So just to be clear, Pam, we're still sending the other recommendations to City Council, but also asking for regular updates. Is that what we're doing?
So we're going to vote on the amendment if we like this amendment, and then once that passes or does not, then we will move the item as amended, which will include the other recommendations. Yes, two-step process.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess the recommendation going forward, the other one is that it'd be up to a 10-year operating agreement.
Can we pull up the original recommendation?
Can you pull up the original one so we know what we're voting on? Because yeah, I'm not in support of the 10-year operating agreement, or up to. It should be definitely shorter with renewable terms along the way.
I think Councillor Layton has a comment.
I was just gonna speak to the item and congratulate all those involved, including the leadership advisory circle, of whom I don't know everyone, but I know several, and I know that that they bring a lot of knowledge to a process like this. I see it filling in a piece that like this committee has many members from the social service sector. We haven't typically over the years, we've had visits from folks from the entrepreneurial and business sector, Indigenous business sector, but haven't really had a large involvement beyond, I would argue, Ms. Wade Beek to a degree. So I'm glad to see that there's a broader, that they're consulting a broader group of folks who clearly know a lot more about it than I do. I'm just going to say that. I won't profess to know much about the entrepreneurial space, particularly around the digital end. But I know that this has been going on for a long time because I've been involved in some of the early conversations when Councillor Wong Tam was really the driving force in trying to bring the right people to the table. When I look at a list like this, I see a lot of great people at that table, and therefore I'm happy to support the recommendations. I also welcome updates to this committee because I want to hear what's going on. I want to hear about the neat stuff that's happening there, and hopefully the great success that they'll have. To Steve's point, like I see where Steve's coming from here. For me, I'm not as worried about the 10-year because we're right now in talks with a Black cultural organization to take on a space that we secured through in Mirvish Village to replace to help replace the loss of a lot of Black-owned businesses in the stretch. We have a cultural building moving back in. They're taking on a 40-year operational agreement with the city. Now, there's no operational money coming from the city in that project, but that was never contemplated. It was all to be run by a different bookless cultural center. So I think I'm not as worried that we won't find someone to take on, or that the length of term isn't long enough. I'm worried that if we go in and say it's such a short period, typically that scares off donors, is the big one in our case with a different bookless cultural center. They want it for longer because they can go out and raise more capital from through donations to actually fund it. Because what they're worried about is like all of a sudden they're there 10 years, then the city says, well, no, you can't have it anymore. And those donors feel that contributed, hopefully in the tens of thousands, that they're not investing in something that will be there to last. I'm supportive of a 99-year lease in that case, but I'm not allowed to offer it to them. I think this is a little bit different because there's a bit of a business element, a significant business element to it that has different interests than a community association. But I'm not sure we should be as worried about it. And there may be a reason why it's 10 years. I didn't hear a sort of a straight up answer as to why did it need to be that long, but there may be a reason. And because I don't know the space, I'm kind of putting my faith and trust in this leadership advisory circle. And because I know some of them and they're great people, and the ones that I don't, I know were curated from the Indigenous community in and around Toronto to help make this project a success, which I really hope that it does become. Thank you, Miigwech.
Steve, did you want to comment back? Andrea, I saw your hand.
I was just waving hello. Okay.
Oh.
Yeah, you know, let's not divert from the issue here. I had advanced that we recognize a report that was advanced, nothing more, nothing less. And it's not up to the advisory committee to lend any type of support towards, because we have not been involved with it. And truth be told, from its onset, it's unfair that it did start. Yes, it did start from an engagement specific to Native Women's Resource Center through Sarah Mandamic, right? And who had a partner working with CCAB, right? That was, you know, there was limitations. Yes, Nancy was involved, but very, very, very little, right? And so that become a larger area. So we've not been involved. And from the task table, we did say we wanted to see what was happening. How would it work for the community? And the community involves a whole number of individuals there, Michael. And those are so many of our individuals who are homeless, are houseless, who, you know, we're trying to get to deal with housing right now. So And I understand that, yes, the individuals want to do regular updates, certainly to tell your truths, because we did not ever hear from, certainly not any time I've been sitting at task, heard from anything on this from, from Selena. So we need to be really honest on that. The second thing is just to say that I was moving a motion to acknowledge it. Acknowledges the report, but it's not, I want us to be honest that we're not supporting or giving the impression we're supporting, so that enhances a recommendation to the city council. So that's my, I acknowledge that they've presented the first time ever, but I can't support coming through the advisory committee to us rubber stamp it when we've not been involved.
Thank you, Andrea. So we can, you can vote to oppose the recommendations, either the original and or the amended ones. So we'll still have the clerks put up the original recommendations.
Order the chair. I think that's really unfair. I think we have to dialogue what we're advancing. You still can't just put it and pit us against one another. I think you need to hear from and I see Francis' hands up there first too as well, because then it really puts us in a shady spot.
Sure. So Francis, I will let you say your comments.
Okay, I'm just cautious about making a recommendation to city council when it's something that we haven't been part of. We haven't had an opportunity to talk to them, to give them advice, to guide them, to have our words included. And now they've come back to us and want us to rubber stamp it for them, going to council that we're on the bandwagon, that we're going, when we didn't even know the bandwagon came to town. So I'm just very, very cautious about saying, yes, we fully endorse this, when in fact this is the first time that we're really getting a fulsome kind of report on it.
One thing that would be really helpful to clarify for me, because I really hear and respect what Andrea and Francis are saying, and we cannot as a committee endorse things that we have not had an opportunity to be involved in. And nothing about us without us, right? I like Steve, I think a few of us didn't really get involved with this because we saw it as kind of outside of our mandate. Mike was just saying, there's not a lot of economic folk. And I'm just wondering, so I remember initial task meetings. I remember task sent some people to the leadership advisory. And I remember maybe one other up. I'm just wondering, could Selena or somebody here provide, could somebody provide an update on what type of engagement was provided to help us? Do you know, Francis? Yeah, it's your hand.
No, just before you go asking for some clarification, task did send members to sit at that table. And then when we asked them what's going on, they said, we don't know, because they only had one meeting and they haven't met in 6 months. And all of a sudden they're bringing things back that they've decided on their own, and they didn't bring them back. And they said, I don't know. I don't even know why I'm sitting there, because they don't ask me anything. I mean, that was Angus who had told me that. So you're right. We haven't heard back.
And I think I only attended a couple of meetings as well. Sorry, I'm just trying to help clarify things for us. And yeah. But anyway, thanks, Francis. Yeah, be good.
Okay, so hearing the concerns on the table, I think between myself and the clerks, we can look at a couple different options to move forward. However, we will have to hold this item again and the motion. So we will move forward to the next item and hopefully review this before the end of the meeting, noting that the meeting does have to end at 5 p.m. today. So with that said, we can move on to the next item, which is 5, the Gulf Operational Review, which is Alex Deegan, Manager of Business Services, Parks, Forestry and Recreation, and Danny Brown, Project Development Officer, Parks, Forestry and Recreation, and they will provide their presentation to the committee. Welcome to the table. The floor is yours.
If the host could give me presenting capabilities.
Hi, Alex. This is the host. I passed presenter to you, so you should have the share option enabled.
I do not. Just to confirm, it's Alex Lavasitis, not Alex Deegan, who will be sharing.
My apologies. That is the mistake I made.
No problem.
You should have presenter now. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for having us here today. My name is Alex Deegan. I'm the manager of partnerships and business services at Parks, Forestry, Recreation. I'm joined today with two of my colleagues from Parks, Forestry, and Rec, Danny Brown, as well as Alex Lavasitis. We're here to provide a quick update. We'll try to keep it short because we want to get to a conversation if possible on our ongoing golf operational review. So today's presentation and discussion goals quickly, just to provide a short project overview of where we're at, answer any questions that you might have, and get some suggestions for any of the following around improving Toronto golf courses, additional and/or complementary uses at those sites, and Indigenous placekeeping opportunities on the courses. So quick project overview. So the city's reviewing the operations of its 5 golf courses. I think an important distinction here to make is that we're looking at the ones that the city is involved in the ongoing day-to-day maintenance of. There's a number of golf courses in the city of Toronto. We're looking at these 5 properties. Currently, we run these sites through a mixed model where the city provides kind of turf maintenance and maintenance of parking lots and facilities and things like that. And then through 2 separate contracts, we do pro shop management. So the people who collect golf fees and give out green fees tickets and golf carts and things like that, as well as food and beverage through a separate contract. So as part of our ongoing operational review, we're considering opportunities to improve these golf courses as places to play golf, making sure we're still providing high quality recreational opportunities at these sites, as well as at council direction, we're considering additional and/or complementary uses of these golf courses. So this exploration is being informed by ongoing processes, including citywide community consultations, which we've been up to all summer. We're trying to talk to as many people in as many forums as possible to get as much information around what the public thinks about these sites. We've brought some consultants on board to help us through this process, and we've been working with Ernst & Young. They're providing kind of the traditional SWOT analysis around golf course operations, helping us develop a procurement strategy that we'll be reporting back to council on, as well as process. So they're a firm that focuses on engagement and public consultation. So this is kind of the story of how we got to where we are today and where we're at in the process. So in July of 2019, Parks, Forestry, and Recreation and Ernst & Young started an evaluation of the city's 5 operated golf courses. This was in large part because in the period from 2013 to 2019, the city was seeing a couple challenging trends at the golf courses. So we were seeing decreasing or flat rates of play, as well as increasing costs, as well as increasing state of good repair and capital needs at the sites. So we thought before going out to secure new operators for what might be a long period of time that we would complete an operational analysis to make sure that we were doing that in the best way possible. So we set about that in 2019. That was, of course, in a pre-COVID world, a pre-COVID landscape. And COVID had a lot of impacts on a lot of different things in a lot of different ways. An unanticipated impact was a positive trend in golf play. We saw golf courses everywhere in Ontario, across Canada and North America, become busier than they've been in a long time. So this was happening as we were undertaking this review. We decided within Parks, Forestry, and Recreation to extend the length of the review. So we brought forward a report to council in September of 2020, recommending that we extend those existing contractual arrangements through the end of 2023. At that time, the public conversation around the use of these big green spaces had also started to shift as the importance of kind of access to local parkland and green space became underscored during the pandemic. People were trying to get out, get into parks. We also were on the receiving end of a letter writing campaign, which brought some new questions into the golf conversation. So when council adopted this report in 2020, They included a recommendation that we should be talking to the public about these alternative and complementary uses. And that's what we've been up to in summer of 2021. We've been completing community consultations. We've been meeting with focus groups and one-on-one interviews with food access groups, the golf community, advocacy and interest groups for individuals who historically aren't represented at golf courses necessarily. We also had a citywide public meeting where we tried to bring a number of people who might have varying perspectives on what to do with the golf courses into a common place to hear each other out. We also had 5 local community workshops, 1 per golf course. So historically, we'd gone out and talked to golf community about what kind of golfers want to see happen at these sites. This time we tried to go out and talk to people who actually lived in direct proximity to these green spaces to try to understand their current experience with the sites and what they might want to see in the future. We also completed an online survey. I think we had around 6,500 responses to that survey, about half golfers, half non-golfers, so lots of opinion. And we also completed an Indigenous focus group with representatives from the Mississaugas of the credit, grassroots community leaders, and representatives from Indigenous serving organizations. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Danny Brown, who's going to just walk through some quick opportunities for improvement and change.
Thanks so much, Alex, and thanks, committee, for having me here today. So in order to develop the alternative and or complementary uses that City Council directed us to consider as part of this review, we wanted to start with what can we actually legally use the golf courses for in terms of their regulatory framework. So this was a starting point to narrow down all the possibilities that were to be considered for the public's consumption of what could happen on the courses. So importantly, all of the courses under review have shared jurisdiction with the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority. All 5 of the courses are located within our natural heritage system and are part of our extensive ravine system. And so as a result, any options that come forward have to be worked with and collaborated with the TRCA on any future changes to the courses. Because they're part of that natural heritage system, the TRCA has a role to play in reviewing any development or changes to those landscapes, whether it be for golf or other uses. Moreover, for municipal bylaws, all of the courses are also subject to the Ravine and Natural Feature Protection Bylaw, as given they're all located in the ravine system. And that bylaw really is a tool that focuses on protecting trees and landforms and the functions of those ravines as ecological places, as places for stormwater mitigation, and as the locations of many of our water courses through the city. And that bylaw protects those natural features and supports the city's environmental stewardship of those spaces. Finally, from a land use policy perspective, all of the golf courses are designated as parks and open spaces, which means a few key limitations or constraints on what uses can be envisioned for the golf courses. Importantly, because they are public parks owned by the City of Toronto or the TRCA as it may be, we cannot sell or dispose of the golf course land. So we can't sell them to a private operator. We can't lease them beyond 21 years because that's considered a disposal. And so they will stay in city ownership or in public ownership as a part of this process. Moreover, because they're parks and open space land uses, development is restricted on these golf course lands, except for a few limited uses, including recreational and cultural facilities, conservation projects, and similar non-residential or commercial uses. Next slide, please. Beyond the more technical regulatory framework, we also have a very broad policy context for how we informed what sort of opportunities we brought to the public to consider as part of this review. And we looked at a number of key documents that inform those opportunities. Importantly, the Toronto Official Plan is the overall sort of instruction manual for how the city should grow and change. So certainly that was an important starting place. But because we're also Parks, Forestry, and Recreation, and these are park spaces, we also brought in a number of the really important strategic plans and policies that we use in PFR to assess opportunities and to achieve our strategic objectives. Those include the parkland strategy, the facilities master plan, which talks about our recreational facilities like arenas, community centers, sports fields, etc. The ravine strategy, which is homing in on specific recommendations for those ravine systems in the city. The biodiversity strategy, the pollinator protection strategy focused on wildlife and our pollinators. Canopy TO is our tree forest plan with a goal of 40% tree canopy coverage across the city. And then also importantly, because these are green spaces where we're considering potential alternative or complementary options, we also wanted to look at the poverty reduction strategy and the resiliency strategy, as these large green spaces could be key to some of our achieving some of our strategic objectives around climate change and access to green space, which are important equity considerations. Of course, that key policy context is not limited to these documents, but that's a quick taste of the kind of things we're looking at. So when we go through the regulatory framework and look at the policy landscape and the goals that we have as a division, it resulted in some ideas that were certainly open for discussion, but more importantly, to narrow down the options, some ideas that were not open for discussion. So some things we looked at, of course, improving the sites as golf courses. That's the primary directive from city councils, to consider these as golf courses. Of course, we want to look at improving complementary non-golf access to the courses, some of which is already happening on the courses. Expanding recreational opportunities like ravine access and trail considerations. Ecological restoration, environmental stewardship. These are important parts of our natural heritage system, really important green spaces and water spaces. And so focusing on the environmental stewardship of the spaces is certainly part of the opportunities we rolled out. Based in part on that letter writing campaign, we heard a lot about access to food growing opportunities in these green spaces. And so that was something that we wanted to bring to the table. And then Jermaine, specifically for this committee here, we wanted to consider how we could facilitate opportunities for Indigenous cultural practices, including placekeeping opportunities, and then any other ideas that fit within that framework. Ideas that were not open for discussion, things like residential uses. Housing is not permitted on parks and open spaces, and so that wasn't part of the scope of consideration as part of this project. Moreover, since a lot of these spaces are adjacent to watercourses or have watercourses running through them as ravines, we also have a lot of complexity and challenges with considering large facilities within floodplains. And all 5 of these courses do have floodplains, some with greater or lesser extents. And of course, as I mentioned, we can't sell or otherwise dispose of these park spaces, nor do we have the financial capability to offer free golf play as part of this process. Next slide, please. So that gets us down to a short list of preliminary opportunities that were preliminary when we brought them out to the community for consultation. Some of these I've already mentioned: improved trail access, tree planting, a construction of a recreational facility outside of that floodplain, like a sports field or a community center or an arena, food growing opportunities like a community or an allotment garden, restoration of natural areas, thinking about how we can restore some of the ecology, especially adjacent to those water courses. Indigenous placekeeping and opportunities was part of that as well. And then a general list of complementary programming, things like winter access or movie nights or nature walks, a whole lot of things that are complementary to golf, not alternative to golf. Next slide, please. So when we brought this out to the community, we did some background due diligence to see how those opportunities lined up with some of the physical characteristics of the different courses. We developed site profiles for each of the 5 courses that looked at the opportunities from a play lens, which is about their role as golf courses, place lens, which is their role as a piece of green space, as a piece of the broader geography, and from a people lens, talking about the demographics in and around the courses as well, to get a really wholesome profile or holistic profile of each of the courses. We lined up each of those opportunities against those site profiles, and it started to tell us a little bit more about what opportunities were maybe more germane to certain courses or could be prioritized on certain courses. So you can see there that improved trail access was really a consideration at Tam, O'Shanter, Don Valley, and Dentonia, because those courses interrupted existing trail connections, whereas the courses along the Humber River have an adjacent trail access, and on it went. So for tree planting, we looked at tree canopy extent. For recreational facility, we looked at extent of floodplain to see where there's opportunities. And for food growing, similarly, we want to try and locate in the consideration of food growing outside of that floodplain, so that we aren't compromising sort of the soil quality or the ability to plant those community gardens. And then, of course, all of the courses had opportunities for natural area restoration, complementary programming, and Indigenous placekeeping. There's no physical constraints on doing those kind of things. Next slide, please. And I'll turn it over to Alex Lavasidis now, one of our community engagement professionals here in PFR.
Thanks, Danny, and thanks for having us at the committee today. So I'm just going to go over what we heard at the Indigenous focus group that we held. So our facilitator was from Process, which were our engagement consultants, and Trina Moyen led this conversation, and she has a lot of connections to the community. So we had participation from a number of groups, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, Aboriginal Legal Services, Matriarchal Circle, Ojibwakan Indigenous Cultural Network. We had Food Sovereigntists present, Minicon Innovation and Design, Red Urban Nation, the Indigenous Advisory Committee and Toronto Arts Council, First Story Youth Guide, Nabike Dawadina Gigwag Youth Landscape and Design Program, a representative from the Inspire Foundation, the Daniel School of Architecture, Edge of the Woods, Moccasin Identifier Project, and then a few community leaders, elders, and Indigenous artists as well. So I'm just going to go through a high level of what we heard from this group, and the reason I'm doing this is just to maybe spark some ideas and then get your comments on not only these, but additional comments. So we are going to take this down and have a discussion after. But what we heard from the focus group was an idea around celebrating Indigenous culture and history on the courses, so art, signage, and trails that reflect historic and ongoing Indigenous presence, incorporating Indigenous storytelling events into the site, and making sure there's no tokenization or appropriation when these things are done. The idea of naturalizing and restoring lands and water, including tree planting and native species only, of course, incorporating and making space for Indigenous uses of the land and the water, so things like community gardens, medicine gardens, and native planting. Participants did indicate that there was a Medawin Teaching Lodge or Sweat Lodge near the north end of Scarlet Woods Golf Course, so that's something that we'll be considering, and space for ceremony and education. In terms of programming, the idea that future golf programming should include specific Indigenous youth programs. The idea of creating economic benefits for Indigenous peoples at the courses. So for example, commissioning Indigenous artists, Indigenous or city ownership or operations, including contracting models. So contracting that supports partnering with Indigenous nonprofits, hiring Indigenous vendors and operators in all seasons, and including Indigenous food at clubhouses via vendors and menus. The idea of improving the Indigenous engagement process overall, so aligning with Indigenous processes and practices rather than Western and colonial practices. Indigenous leaders and voices should be engaged first and continuously, that's something we heard, and being transparent about next steps and updating participants on where and how their input is contributing to the outcome. So these are important as we move forward and as we plan future engagement activities and consultation activities as well. And then some other considerations were to center Indigenous placekeeping for all additional complementary uses and to use the lands to prioritize serving Indigenous peoples, youth, and people with lower incomes. So I'll pass it to Alex to go over some of the next steps.
Yeah, so thanks, Alex and Danny. So within the next few months, we'll be finalizing our operational review and reporting back to Council, either in December of this year or early 2022. The recommendations within that report are going to be focusing on improving golf play to support future operations, integrating complementary programming and enhanced environmental stewardship at all courses, and identifying site-specific opportunities. Our original task with this operational review was really looking at the existing operating model and coming back to Council with a recommendation for a sourcing strategy. In response to 2020, we folded in a lot of other considerations, and City staff are currently trying to balance those into a report and recommendations for City Council's consideration. So we recognize that we don't have all the answers currently. We're still early in the process, and we do want to stay connected. So we've listed our emails here, and feel free to reach out if anything comes to your mind after the meeting. We also have some questions on the next slide, but we can pull them down as well. We're hoping for a conversation. We'd included some prompts here, but really we want to hear from you, whatever you'd like to share today. But any specific comments or suggestions regarding the content from what we'd already heard coming out of that Indigenous focus group discussion. If there's any additional suggestions for proposed or alternative complementary uses at the sites that City staff should be considering, how you'd want to use the golf course lands in future, what can the City do to improve experience in and around Toronto golf courses, and how should we engage with Indigenous community and organizations as this project moves forward. So thank you very much. That's our presentation, and happy to have questions or comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Diggin, Mr. Brown, and Ms. Lavasides. Members, do you have any questions of the staff on this item? If so, please raise your hand so that I can call on you. And I see, oh, here's Francis. Okay, go ahead, Francis.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in early. First of all, thank you so much for this presentation. I know so little about golf, but you don't have to know about golf to improve the lands that you have. And I'm grateful that you've come to us early on before you've carved anything in stone. I like that you're looking at it and that you're giving us an opportunity. I really would, first of all, if I had a genie's lamp here, I would change all 5 names to an Indigenous name or an Indigenous themed name for all 5 golf courses. There's nothing sacred about Dentonia. So why not give it a little Indigenous flavor? But I'd also like to see a plaque. You know, those beautiful bronze plaques that they have. I'd like to have something outlining the importance of the land that they're going to be hitting their golf balls on and what it was for, what we used it for, and the respect that has to be given for that land. So I'd like to have that memorialized in some way with a plaque, a bronze plaque at each one, so everybody knows about it before they start hitting the ball. Just for your own information, I know you talked to the Mississaugas of the Credit, but they're a rural organization, a rural nation. We're urban. So you really have to take into account the people who are here, who live here, the urban population. They're your public golfers. So make sure you're talking to the Aboriginal Affairs Committee for the City of Toronto, which you are doing, and you're starting off, and thank you very much. But also take it to task. That's another organization that will come up with a lot of bright ideas for you. And I love the idea of medicine gardens and incorporating that into the landscape. And I'm just curious on what came up with poverty reduction strategy. How possible does that play into this? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I can address the question about the poverty reduction strategy. So the poverty reduction strategy informed 2 of the approaches to this analysis of the golf courses. One is that we know that equity and access to green space is a really important part of creating opportunities for low-income folks and for folks who are struggling. So certainly that was a driver of some of the consideration for increasing access to the golf courses. More specifically, the poverty reduction strategy is also aligned with our exploration of food growing opportunities on the courses and was part of the motivation for us to reach out to the food access groups and have a specific focus group with those organizations. So there was both broad and specific reasons for considering the poverty reduction strategy. And importantly, when we did the site profiles, I mentioned the place lens. There was an equity lens to reviewing how the different courses, neighborhoods around them lined up with the city's equity index, which considers low-income populations, newcomer populations, as well as Indigenous populations using StatsCan information. So there was also an equity lens put on analyzing the demographics of each of the courses as well, which aligns also with the poverty reduction strategy. Thank you for the question.
Thank you
Do
for
we
your
have
comments
any
as
other
well.
questions? Oh, I see Andrea. Go ahead.
Thank you again, and I'll echo the same thing. I really appreciate the presentation. Anytime we're dealing with land, it's always a really good thing. And I acknowledge Francis, because you're right. I'm connecting the dots here. You have the district, the cultural districts. You have the whole issue around the strategy for technology. And so you have to bring this all in together and how that fits. I appreciate that you're providing the opportunity for other cultural spaces, medicine gardens, actually providing on the land initiatives for our young people and older individuals too as well, for initiatives, and to look at how do we link all of the parkland initiatives to see if you look at Toronto as a collective, as I'll say the creators garden, because there's so much plant life that can be utilized and be expanded upon in building in the language, building in the not just for just the names, but also ensuring that there's more to that designated space, and that it gives us an opportunity of having you learn some of our planting and our appreciation, and working together with some of these young people, so there's an exchange there too. I see the real benefits on this, but again, I'd like to wrap it together with, in fact, the other two presentations, and to see what would be the risk factor. How could we look at connecting the digital strategy that's in place so there is safety? There's safety through the network within the ravines, and also the places there that people also can hide. And so I just think that there's some real merit to bringing your minds together and on some really positive initiatives that can work for the benefit of the community. So you won't go.
Thank you, Andrea. Staff, do you have any responses to Andrea's comments?
We just say thank you, and that we take that away. Thank you for your comments, and also to Francis's comments as well. Thanks.
Excellent. And are there any other speakers to the item? If you wish to speak, please raise your hand or unmute your mic to let me know. And I'm not seeing any. Do I have a motion to receive the item? Let me see 1 second. I think we have a draft. Yes, we have a draft motion on the floor. Host, would you be able to put that up when you have a second? So in case you can't see it, anyone, the motion is that the Aboriginal Affairs Advisory Committee request the General Manager, Parks, Forestry and Recreation to incorporate the committee's feedback into the work on Gulf operational review. Do I have a mover? I see Francis with her hand up. All in favor? And that's everyone. Pam, I think you have an update on the first item, is that correct?
Yes, thank you. Me again, folks. Okay, so before we took a break to investigate a little bit further, we were going to show the original recommendations as per Steve's request. And if you look to item 2, that is the item specifically, Steve, that you had questions about. And you will notice in the language, it does say up to 10 years. And I still have a motion on the floor, which was the amendment addition to the recommendations we see on the screen that we will have to vote on. You can zoom in on the side there if you guys weren't able to see that. You're on mute, Steve. I thought I saw you talking. Okay, maybe he isn't. Okay, he wasn't talking to us, I don't think. So if we can put the motion back up on the screen, please. And so the motion is to amend the recommendations to include that this table get regular updates, plus the recommendations that you had seen. Just on your screen. So first we will vote to accept the amendment, and second to all the recommendations. So to report regularly on the progress of ICIE to the AAAC. Do I have a motion to move this? Or sorry, a mover? Brian, all in favor? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, so any opposed? The motion carries. So the second part of this motion would be to move the item with the recommendations to include the amendment. Do I have a mover? And clerks, if you want to put that on the screen for everyone for their comfort levels, that would be greatly appreciated. This is not the motion.
Sorry, Co-Chair, could you clarify what you would like to see displayed?
Sorry, I thought we needed a motion to move to accept the recommendations with the amendment. But if we're good with just the amendment, then we can move on. Please clarify.
So the motion to adopt the recommendations as amended can be put by you from the floor. We don't have a text for that.
So that is my motion, folks, is to adopt the recommendations with the amendment. Mover? Shaker? All in favor?
No. Did that motion change drastically? Does that motion, I didn't get a chance to read it, it was so small, I put them on glasses, I still couldn't read it. Is the recommendation moving forward that we endorse their report and go with whatever they asked us to endorse?
No, the motion was to accept the recommendations plus the amendment that they report back to the table on a regular basis.
Oh, so it is a recommendation from this committee to move forward with our endorsement, I guess, to council.
Yeah, I
on
need
the recommendations
too. I don't know what it is now.
Yeah. Like, I'm okay with it if we're just accepting their report and that's it, and we're not endorsing anything.
We can't just simply accept the report because there are recommendations that need to go to council. So we either have to vote with the amendment, or which we already just passed the motion, or we allow the recommendations to go forward without our input on it, but someone would have to put forward that motion and that has to go through the clerks. So if someone at the table wants to do that, then they have to email the clerk that the email provided at the beginning and make that motion.
We can do anything we want to do, Pamela. This is the Aboriginal Affairs Advisory Committee. You can't move a motion, you're chair. It's really difficult. So I advanced that.
I didn't move a motion. I presented a motion and everyone voted.
We voted on the second half, but now you're trying to incorporate it as part and parcel. We're acknowledging, same thing as Steve saying, acknowledging the presentation with those recommendations. You can do that. That's not a problem.
I'll allow the clerks to explain some of the procedural aspects here, but we can't actually just receive the item because there are recommendations that are going to council. So we can recommend that it goes forward without our input, but again, a motion will have to be put forward by someone at the table. And the motion that was just presented was that there's an amendment to include another recommendation, which was to report back to this table. And the vote was on all of the recommendations plus the amendment, which was presented from this table. So there was a total of, I believe, 7, and that was everything that we just voted on. And Steve, I don't know if you missed the part because I thought you were going to speak, but I noticed you turn your phone off. That item 2 mentioned, the language was up to 10 years. So I just wanted to flag that for you because I know that that was the question that you had.
Yeah.
So clerks, if there's any other items here that you think the table should understand from a procedural context, please, please chime in.
So I will add another motion for non-confidence. I'm sorry, this is really out of whack here.
Councillor Layton.
If I may, the actual language of the motion that's on the floor is that the interim general manager of economic development and culture and the director of the IAO recommend. We then voted on an amendment that added advice from this committee to report particularly. I'm not sure that adopting the rest of the motion actually endorses it. What we voted on, this amendment just says add this recommendation to the recommendations that will go to executive committee and then to city council. So by voting on the item as amended, which is this as well as the additional piece, doesn't necessarily say the Aboriginal Affairs Committee endorses it. However, it doesn't change the other recommendations. It just adds a recommendation. So it adds more to what executive would see. I don't know if that's at all any clarity, but like we amended the recommendations coming from staff that would go to executive. Essentially, regardless of what we do here, I believe it goes to executive. It's just if we don't add this one, then this doesn't get added for executive and therefore isn't added. Is that correct from the clerks? Because last time we had an item recently that we didn't adopt here. It still went to executive, but essentially I think the chairs intervened and said something to executive, and we just made sure that it came back or something around those lines. Is that right? Just to the clerk.
So, members, the committee, the committee has the option of recommending that the item travel to committee without recommendation. Because the committee has the option to adopt the item, adopt the recommendations in the item, amend them either by adding additional sections as was just done or by amending wording in the individual parts of the recommendation. Or if the committee cannot endorse the recommendation, it doesn't have the option to receive the item and stop it from going any further, but it can move that it travel without recommendations. It will still go. The staff report will still go on its journey to executive committee.
I think that's what we understand. It's going to go there whether we like it or not. It's on its way. What we have to decide is, do we support it, or do we say, no, send it on its way without our seal of approval? So that's really, isn't it, Sylvia? That's what we have to do. Either say, yes, we put our stamp of approval on it, or no, we don't put our stamp of approval on it.
That is co-chairs. That is that's a fair representation. So yes, either adopt the recommendations as they are, amend them, or not approve them. The committee may, by motion, add a rationale if it chooses. So, you've already adopted one recommendation. This one can travel forward. So the transmittal letter to executive committee will include that recommendation. You may elect not to forward the staff recommendations, and you may opt to advise as to the reason why you are not forwarding the staff recommendations.
So Clerk, just to be clear, does anyone have to move this? It's already part of the presentation, right? I'm sorry for the confusion here. I'm going through the rule book and I'm not coming up with anything.
So currently what's before the committee is, I mean, the item as it is before you right now, you have the staff recommendations, the 5 staff recommendations, and the 1 additional recommendation that you adopted. So that is before you right now. That is what you can adopt.
So there was a vote to adopt the amendment, which was that we hear a report back on a regular basis. That passed. Now there is a vote on the table to adopt all the recommendations with the amendment, yes or no.
And just so, Sylvia, if it fails, then it moves without recommendation.
That is correct, yes.
Okay, so it's 1 vote. Those on the committee that don't wish to support can vote against, and it moves forward without recommendation to the next committee. Does the amendment move with it or no?
So that I was just going to say, so at this point, if the item fails, it will fail altogether. So if the question that's put, shall the item as adopted, as amended, carry? So at this point, it might be, oh, sorry, I see a question from Member Sanderson.
Yeah. So if we vote nay on sending it with our recommendation, it doesn't stop us from asking for reports whenever we want them anyway, so that they will have to report back to us if we request them to come to our meeting and report. You're mute, Sylvia.
Apologies. Members of the committee may ask that the vote be separated and vote on separate sections separately. So as long as it's put to 2 votes, then you can vote on the amendment that was adopted separately and on the 5 recommendations in the staff report separately. And if the vote is different on those, then that will determine what gets carried to the committee.
I just want to make one final plea to try to understand this, because obviously my vote counts just like everyone else's. I mean, we heard, Councillor Longtam come and talk about a process 9 years in the making that would create some economic opportunities for our community at a time when economic opportunities are needed. And is our opposition to this, or some opposition in the committee, mostly around, Steve, for you, is it the term of the lease? And Andrea and others, is it the degree of consultation? I'm just, because there's always a lot going on. There was lots of consultation through task and the LAC and the other stuff. And so I'm just wondering if there's anything we can do to get us all on side, or because it's better when we move in consensus, right? And so I'm struggling a bit, because I would like to create economic opportunities for the community, but I also want to make sure that we're moving forward in a good way with a mutual understanding about this and we all feel good about it. I'm just wondering if anything can be done here, whether it's in the wording of the motion or the nature of the recommendation, that doesn't slow this process down any longer. I don't know, Andrea or Francis or others, if people have any thoughts or perspectives on this.
Yeah, for me, I have a level of uncomfort with this. I know very little about this project. Yeah, I've heard people talking about it for the last 9 however years. And now it's coming to fruition, and good work on their part. I guess it's my level of uncomfort in voting on this is number one. I feel like I don't know enough to vote. There's a number of recommendations contained in the report. I'm not really familiar with all of them. The one that really stuck with me was the up to 9-year lease section, or up to 10-year lease, sorry, section, which it seems like a rather long time, particularly if there's governance issues with the group set up, and we're stuck with them for 10 years. So yeah, not sure really what to do there. I'm not comfortable enough to endorse this as a member of this committee. So that's my issue here. And I don't want to tie it up at our table. if they want to go to council, that's fine. And if we do vote for endorsing this, am I able to abstain from voting? Because simply, I feel like I don't know enough to understand all the things that I'm voting for contained in this motion.
Thanks for that clarity, Steve. Yeah, go ahead, Suzanne. Yeah.
Thank you. You raised some good points, Steve. And my memory of this whole process, I know that I participated in an engagement exercise, and my memory tells me that we were engaged at the task table, but like you, Steve, it's not within my mandate, so I stepped away. But I do feel, like in my heart, I really feel that we were welcomed to engage. Whether we did or not is another matter, but I do feel we were invited to engage. I think they did a very good job in that sense. And I do know that many other Indigenous people who are very interested in this project are engaged. But like you, Steve, like I did, like I had to step away because it's not within my mandate.
Go ahead, Francis.
Okay. I just am very reluctant, first of all, because I haven't been engaged. When you stop and think, this is 9 years in the making, and now we're hearing about it. All leading up to now, there's been pockets of this one's involved. You hear this a little bit about it. You hear that, oh, it's going to be economic development. I went to a meeting where we sat and listened, and people had all kinds of things they were asking of the committee that were sitting there at the time. And most of their ideas, their suggestions were said, no, that's not the kind of place we're going to have. One of the questions was, is there going to be childcare while we have these entrepreneurs working and setting up their business? And they said, no, this is not that kind of place. And so every idea that was put up there was kind of said, well, we'll write that down, but it's not really what this is all about. And that was the only meeting I went to on this in 9 years. One meeting. I can't make an endorsement for it. I'm sorry.
If I just could, it has been in front of this committee before, because it was here in 2018 where we unanimously endorsed the idea of it competing for the Smart Cities Challenge. So I would just flag that, like, that's the last time I have seen it, but we did endorse it here. So there was I think a presentation at the time, if I remember correctly. So I just wanted to flag that.
Yeah, but Mike, wasn't that for it to be entered into a competition for something else? Like it was for that city competition that we were putting a bid for?
Well, it was both to endorse the Indigenous Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship and support the Indigenous District application for Smart Cities Challenge. So it kind of reads as endorsing the notion of it. Like, while we didn't have recommendations for how council should interact with the body or the agency or whatever you want, the idea, we did kind of endorse it in principle. It seems from that, but I don't know.
Okay.
I'd like to invite Millie. I saw that your hand was up.
Miigwech. I don't endorse the project as well. It doesn't seem to reflect who we are. As an Anishinaabe Kwe, I look through a lens of Minnow-Bimadzwin, the good life or way of life. And with Ampava, I look at the community, and it includes the houseless. So we're bringing programming and food to the houseless, and working with and partnering with Indigenous organizations in Toronto. It became, it's very apparent that housing is a huge need. And along with that is the notion of land back. And I know the city it has engaged in discussions regarding land back. And from within the culture, again, looking through a lens of Minobimadzewin and a trauma-informed lens, there's a notion of re-villagizing that I've heard, you know, and discussed with Andrea Christian, and she mentioned, I think it was Elizabeth Dockstetter, who puts this forward. So, you know, looking at the land as Mother Earth, you know, and not so much as a resource, you know, and looking at our responsibilities, we should include animals, plants, the waters, you know, and the sacredness of all of creation. And I find that today, that's what's missing in all the meetings. And I want to advance that we acknowledge all of creation in what we do going forward. Miigwech.
Thank you, Millie. Okay, so as Sylvia mentioned, we can split this vote. The amendment was voted and passed. The next vote will be on if we will vote to accept the recommendations, which I think we all know where most of you stand. So that is the motion on the floor. Do we have a mover to accept the recommendations as presented without the amendment? Okay, so seeing none, the motion fails. And that confirms.
So, I'm sorry, I didn't understand the language of that. So this would be to just to clarify, we have the motion ahead in front of us. So
to adopt the recommendations as presented in the presentation. Okay. The amendment is separate. That motion already passed. So now we're presenting the motion on the floor without the amendment. This is simply for the recommendations that were in the presentation, to adopt them or not adopt them as a table.
Okay. Do we need a motion for that, Sylvia? Because they're the motion, it's what's in front of committee, right? Like we need to vote on it one way or another.
Where did Sylvia go?
That's correct. Oh,
go ahead, Sylvia. Sorry.
Correct, co-chair. You may simply ask the question: is the committee in favor or opposed to the recommendations before the committee?
Okay, so is the table in favor or opposed of the recommendations that were presented to the committee in item 1?
I think you have to ask all in favor and then see where the chips land.
All in favor? All opposed? Clerks, can you confirm the vote for me?
I asked a question about abstaining. I'm abstaining. No one did answer my question.
You can abstain, Steve.
I think I've been informed by the clerks that everyone has to vote as a member.
I've got an out for you, Steve. You can just shut off your camera.
Madam Chair?
Yes.
If you wish to for a recorded vote, I can call the names of members.
Sure. All in favor?
Sorry. Just clarification. All in favor for what again? Sorry.
For the recommendations that were presented in the first presentation, the 5 recommendations presented in regard to ICIE.
So can I ask again, and I'll just see if, okay.
Mike, did you have something you wanted to say? Oh. Okay, all in favor?
I'll see the hands in favor. Pamela Hart, Jeffrey Schiffer, Brian Winters, Suzanne Brunel, and Councillor Mike Clayton.
All opposed?
Opposed? Andrea Christian, Francis Sanderson, Larry Frost, and Millie Knapp. Madam,
Sorry, go ahead.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
we have 5 members in favor and 4 members opposed.
Thank you very much. The motion carries, and that wraps up that item. And I know that this meeting, we were informed, needs to end at 5 p.m. today, so I'll pass it on to Brian to address the remaining items. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Pam. And yeah, I feel terrible that Lindsay's been waiting this long, and I see Barbara Powell's been waiting this long, and we had a registered speaker on this. We have 16 minutes to go. I don't know that it makes a lot of sense for us to move to the next item. Like it's going to be really tight, and it's definitely a very important item to address. So clerks, can I get some clarification on this? Can I move to or suggest that we defer this item to the next meeting?
Mr. Chair, yeah. Sorry,
Yeah.
Sylvia, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead, Jonathan.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Chair, yes, it's up to the committee if you wish to defer the remaining items on the agenda.
I know that we do have the sunset issue today, so we have to be done in 15 minutes. So yeah, I guess that probably makes the does anyone want to comment on that? Like I'm sorry that this has taken so long. That ICIE item sure did chew up a lot of time. How about, would it be possible to put a motion on the floor to defer the last 2 items? And does someone want to move that?
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. Item number 7 is only for information. The committee can just move a motion to receive the item if they wish.
Okay, I can quickly read that if that helps. The last item is item AA14.7, vacancy on the Aboriginal Affairs Advisory Committee. This is a letter from the city clerk placed on the agenda as a formal acknowledgement of another vacancy on our committee created by the resignation of member Blanche Miawasigi. This item is for information only. Members, do you have any questions of staff on this item? And if so, please raise your hand or unmute your mic to let me know, please. Okay. Not seeing any hands. Okay, hearing no further speakers, do I have a motion to receive the item? Dr. Schiffer. I have a motion from Jeff Schiffer. All those in favor, please raise your hands. I see Suzanne and only Suzanne. Any opposed to receiving this item? Okay, so like we do need votes on this, right? Like unless you turn your screen off and choose to abstain, as Mike had suggested to Steve during the last one, we do need in favor or opposed on receiving this item.
Brian, this is becoming really difficult and hard to understand now. Now we've lost the whole intent of an Aboriginal Affairs Advisory Committee. I would have liked to have thought we would come to a place where we would look for solutions. We could put some things under the pillow so we could have further discussions and not voting against one another, because that's where you're placing us. And so it calls into question the whole intent of the committee itself, where we're at now or not.
The opportunity was there, Andrea, that if you had a motion that you wanted, or if you just wanted to make amendments to the motion that had been put on the floor and included them in that presentation, that you could have provided it to the city clerks. They did not receive a motion from anyone within the committee. So at that point, we have to vote on what is before the committee. So back to the issue at hand about this vacancy. I do have a motion from Jeff Schiffer. And this is just information. This is just to receive this item. Can I have a vote of all those in favor? Please raise your hand. I see Suzanne, Mike, and any opposed? Okay, well, having received 2 votes and then a bunch of non-votes, the motion carries. Larry, I see you've turned your screen off. Larry, would it be possible to have you complete a closing for us?
Mr. Chair.
Or do I need a motion to adjourn? Sorry, it seems like people are dropping off.
Mr. Chair, you still need to, the committee still need to vote on the deferral on item number 6. And we are preparing a motion and we can display in a moment.
Okay, I'd appreciate that when you have it ready. Sorry, clerks, I'm just having a quick look at the list here to see who's still in attendance. 1. Okay, we're still good. Can you put the motion back on the screen, please? My apologies. So the motion is that consideration of the item be deferred until November 15, 2021, the next meeting of the Aboriginal Affairs Advisory Committee. Can I have a mover, please?
That's item number 6.
Yes, it was Lindsay's presentation, Lindsay and Barbara Powell. Which I'm really looking forward to when we finally get to hear it.
Looking for a motion that this be deferred to the next meeting. I'll make that motion that item number 6 goes to the next meeting.
Thank you, Francis. And my screen is freezing, so I can't really see what else is going on. My apologies. Okay, everyone seems to have started moving again. So thank you for putting that forward, Francis. All those in favor? Across the board. Beautiful. So the motion carries. Thank you very much. Yeah, and we will now have a closing blessing from Larry Frost. When you're ready, Mr. Frost.
We give thanks to the Creator for this meeting. We ask that the Creator guide us with a positive mind, grant us a clear mind, a pure heart, and courage. A clear mind to make well thoughts and intelligent decisions, that we always follow our sacred teachings of love and respect for each other, for all our meetings that will be coming forward. But in my prayer, I just said to the Creator that we all come together in unity. This was a very good meeting. I felt that there was a little bit of separation for a while, but I asked the Creator to bring us back. So I asked that all our hearts come back together, our minds come back together in a positive way. So with that, I see Miigwech, thank you.
Thanks, Lawrence.
Thank you, Larry.
Thanks, Lauren. Larry. Have a good weekend, everybody.
Mr. Co-Chair.
Bye, all.
Okay, everyone.
Mr.
Bye.
Co-Chair, before you,
Mr. Co-Chair.
before
Hi,
you
Sylvia.
adjourn,
Yeah.
before you adjourn the meeting, Co-Chair, did you wish to address the issue of any further absences at today's meeting? We have prepared a motion for the committee's consideration.
I mean, we can. Yeah, we do have 7 minutes. If you wanted to go ahead and put that up, that would be great.
Didn't we just close the meeting with the closing prayer?
We did.
Yeah. My apologies, Sylvia. Steve has a point there. This is
Move on, guys. See you later. Have a good weekend.
This is difficult solo. Take care, everyone.